開けるんだ開くのさその不思議な扉を登れるんだ登るのさ未来に触れるその心炸裂のドミノ節消えてゆく皆の命愛してる女性に裏切られ白涙が宇宙にさまよその行方さえも知らぬただただ自由に漂う登れるな登るのさ未来に触れるその心今私の遠い技熱く燃える遠い技正義の証遠い技敵を落とせ遠い技我らの遠い技
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman.
And Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to peer into the delightfully deranged mind of Tomino Yoshiyuki with our Tomino-THON. This week on the show, we're bringing this episode to you from a very special place. That's right, we are in the land between the sea and the shore, the land where the soul goes to rest. We're in that place we have all been to, and yet, save for a lucky few, none of us remember. So we are relating to you this podcast in the way the Me Ferrario tell it, because today we are telling you a tale of Byston Well. We are going to talk about the tale of Aura Battler Dunbine, the 1983 anime directed by our friend Tomino Yoshiyuki. That is a crazy genre blend of fantasy and mecha. It's kind of like an isekai show before isekai shows were a thing. It's an absolutely wild show, one I've been very excited to get to ever since playing through Super Robot Wars Y, which heavily features characters, and so I finally get to actually see like the story and where all these characters fit and stuff like that. But yes, we are discussing Aura Battler Dunbine. Like we did with Combat Mecha Zabungle, we are splitting this conversation into two podcasts. So we have part 1 today, where we will be discussing episodes 1 to 19. So about the first half-ish of the show, we're stopping at 19 because that's a nice kind of narrative note to end the conversation on. And then next week, we will cover the second half of the show, episodes 20 to 49, to complete our Aura Battler Dunbine discussion. But yes, Jonathan, we're here to talk about one of Tomino's, I think, most wild shows in his career, and one of his most important because of how influential it is in his life, even outside of him being an anime director, but him as a novelist. He spends a lot of time in the world of Byston Well, but this is kind of our introduction to it.
And I understand why he spends a lot of time in the world of Byston Well, because it is an easy world to get lost in. You know, of the Tomino shows I have seen, this might be the weirdest one. And that is saying something. This show is fucking wild. It broke my brain a little bit. It confused me. It invigorated me. There's a point in the last batch of episodes we're talking about, Sean. You said nice narrative note to end on. I would call it a narrative note that we have to end on because there's no way to talk past it in one episode. Because there's a point in those episodes where I just wrote like half page in my notes, this is fucking wild. And I think that is the right discussion for this crazy, crazy show that like breaks your brain in part because it predates so many everything that you would compare it to. It predates.
Yes.
Like it predates Dragon Quest. It predates Sword Art Online and the modern isekai. It predates Berserk and the modern like dark fantasy Japanese anime manga genre. And so it is kind of a work without peer, at least in its time. And there literally is nothing else like it. It is wild.
Yes, it is definitely a show that you're constantly watching and you're like, I can't believe that this thing exists. Like, It's just, it is so kind of out of time. It's so singular. And it's just such a fascinating thing because it is like this precursor to so many different kinds of genres that we get in anime and manga in the 5-10 years after Aura Battler Dunbine, where it becomes much more commonplace. But it is also fundamentally a Tomino mecha show. And so it's like one of the crazy things is that it is both of these. It is this kind of, not only is it a kind of precursor to this whole range of genres of Japanese anime fantasy stuff, but it is also blending it so seamlessly with Tomino's kind of house style and all of your mecha thing. It's such a crazy early, if not the first example of like bioorganic mechs, which becomes obviously a much bigger thing in the late 90s with stuff like Neon Genesis Evangelion. Yeah, it is a nuts show. And it's all that, and it's also to me like a, kind of with Zabungle in a different way. It is one of those missing links between Mobile Suit Gundam and Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, where you see a lot of the bigger political maneuvering and the kind of complicated series of interlocking factions stuff that is really big in Zeta Gundam is very much here in Dunbine, where I think you see the influence where that comes from these kind of Sengoku era set dramas with like using historical figures like Oda Nobunaga, which is much more apparent here, but that is like, what he takes forward into Zeta Gundam. It's just, it's a crazy show on its own merits. It's a crazy show looking at it in the filmography of Tomino. It's just one I was so excited to get to because I loved the aesthetic of the show. I love the characters. I love the music and the sound effects that I all got from Super Robot Wars Y, but all of that was divorced from all the narrative context in which it originally existed in the show. And so watching the show has been a fun kind of active discovery for me of kind of like having these things I'm familiar with, but then getting to kind of unveil this larger thing that they all exist in, which I hadn't yet been actually exposed to.
I had been exposed to none of it. So I was just like, oh man, one of the main characters is named Burn Bunnings. Oh, we're in for something good. And we were.
Yes. And for me, the biggest shock of everything in watching Aura Battler Dunbine, coming from the little bit I knew from Super Robot Wars Y, was discovering that Shot Weapon is supposed to be an American. I assumed the man named Shot Weapon was from the crazy fantasy world. Little did I know that he's from, like, California.
I mean, Sean, can you blame the rest of the world for thinking that there are Americans named Shot Weapon?
It's a very fair point. It's a very fair point. But yes, so any other, Jonathan, kind of overall thoughts about Dunbine before we get into the history?
No, I want to get into the history and I want to talk about this crazy show.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. So, obviously, where we start with the history is this is in the period of Tomino just being insane and making 1,000 things at the same time. So while he was still in the midst of making Combat Mecha Zabungle, which recall, again, that Zabungle is a show that Tomino was basically jumped into doing, that it was not a show that he started with. He kind of like went in halfway through pre-production and basically remade what that whole show was. While he was doing that, he then started developing his own new project from the ground up, something totally original to Tomino. And that's what became his next, and in many ways, one of his most important projects to his career, and what we're talking about today, Aura Battler Dunbine. Aura Battler Dunbine started life as a series originally titled Amarugan, but the sponsors were concerned that it could sound like Amaru Gangu, or Gangu ga Amaru, which in Japanese would mean too many toys. So they're like, we can't just have you title a thing that makes it sound like we're telling them, look at all these fucking toys we got, is basically what the title sounds like in Japanese. And so he originally changed the title to Surbine, and then later changed that to Dunbine. Surbine has kind of survived in the franchise as the name for a Aura Battler that exists kind of like only in the model in the video game space. So if you've played Super Robot Wars Y, the Surbine is a Aura Battler in there, but it's not in the actual show. But that's where that name comes from. Tomino liked his original name, Amarugan, enough that he did keep it around, and he repurposed it as the name of one of the main characters in his book, Wings of Reen, we'll talk about in a bit, but that's the book he wrote at the same time as Dunbine that's set in the world of Byston Well. So he's like, fuck you, sponsors, sure, you can make me change it on the show, but I'm going to keep Amarugan because I like the way that name sounds, and just put it in my book. Tomino chose to set his new series in a totally different kind of setting, which is a fantasy setting, specifically what one would call high fantasy or medieval fantasy, a la something like The Lord of the Rings being the most famous example of this genre, We'll do a deeper dive into this genre choice a bit later. We'll have a whole genre talk because it's a huge topic with this show. But suffice to say, for where we're at right now in the notes, it was an unconventional choice for a genre at this point in 1982/3. And this kind of genre was more or less completely unheard of in anime. There basically is no anime that predates Dunbine that is in this specific type of fantasy genre. And even if you expand that out to the broader world of Japanese culture, looking at books, manga, in terms of things created by Japanese creators and not translated from English, basically you don't have almost any other examples other than a couple of little ones that predate this. So it is a show that is what I call on a genre island. It has basically no peers at its point of production. As we've seen with Tomino's other projects, Tomino went into very great detail designing and fleshing out the world and setting for his new show, a world which he would call Byston Well. Tomino would give multiple explanations for the origin of that name throughout different interviews, but the gist, if you kind of put all of his explanations together, is that it's a corruption of the English phrase Byston Well, which is even clearer if you hear it pronounced in Japanese, Byston Well. And with him wanting to kind of give the sense of it's another world which lies by or through an old stone. Like, I think really the thing he wants to say is through stone well, not by stone well, but prepositions in English, if you're a Japanese speaker, whatever. And so this notion of you going through some ancient stone well to visit a fantasy world like something out of a fairy tale, like the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. He described Byston Well as the land which lay between the sea and the shore, made up of the energies of the earth and the life force of its people. In the pre-production notes for the show, dated July 1982, Tomino noted that he was dissatisfied with the way that anime had clearly delineated and separated out genres like mecha, what he calls meisaku mono, which I assume is referring to world masterpiece theater style stories, meisaku meaning masterpiece in Japanese, and then also he says yodo mono, which literally translates to little kid stories, but I think he's referring to fairy tales. And he sort of says these are like the three major genres that are popular in anime, and they're two kind of like set in stone. And so he wanted to relieve that dissatisfaction with the kind of genre options he had to blend a mecha show with a fantasy show, specifically specifying in the notes that he was not trying to aim for a fantasy show in and of itself. That his goal was to create this kind of unique genre blend that kind of broke the framework of things around it. And in that way, he was very successful. Whether or not that would translate to the success of the show itself is something we'll address.
But this actually makes a lot of sense to me, because, I mean, you've got to remember in context that Tomino is still, in 1982, we're still on the cusp of, like, the idea of there being anime fully original by, like, a major creator is still a pretty new thing. Like, it's not, completely unheard of at this point, but the, like, bulk of anime at this point would still be, like, the World Masterpiece Theater thing of, based on recognizable stories, or the, like, Tezuka model of based on recognizable manga properties. And Tomino still occupies a pretty unique position, and in that position, there's sort of a genre rigidity, because the place where you mostly saw those was mecha shows.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that he would want to expand that. And there is an interesting way in that for the year 1983, Aura Battler Dunbine does kind of combine bits and pieces of, like, every major anime movement up to that point. And that's kind of fascinating to me, because it does have, like, remember, he worked on a lot of those World Masterpiece Theater shows. He storyboarded heavily for Takahata Isao on Heidi, Girl of the Alps. And, like, that experience is obvious in Aura Battler Dunbine. It has a lot of those qualities, and I think that's an interesting part of this show's legacy.
Yes, absolutely. And let's get a little bit of some of the influence. I have a bigger thing on some influence stuff we'll get into later, but just there's some things. And one thing I want to make clear at this point in the notes is that, unfortunately, the books that I have don't go as deep into the production of Dunbine as I would like, because they're much more focused on his, like, Gundam shows. And so I couldn't find, like, a singular, really good source from Tomino himself about what he states his influences for this are. And so this is a lot of me kind of piecing together different elements just by looking at the show and thinking about kind of the historical context in which it's made, what his influences must have been. So just to make it clear, like, some of this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I think some informed speculation based on he's pulling from a place that is where I had my focus for my degree in literature, which is all Victorian, and there's a lot of Victorian influence here. So one thing that motivated Tomino was a desire to depict more complicated human relationships than he had in Gundam. This is a thing he says in the little, like, snippet I have from the project notes that's in one of my books. And so he was thinking about, I want to make even a more complicated web of human relationships. He strongly disliked the character archetypes and relationship templates that he felt had calcified in anime and drama. And so he set out to create a story with a complicated web of relationships, specifically inspired by Sengoku era set dramas. Sengoku being the Warring States period in Japanese history, where you had a wide range of different kind of militant factions controlled by different daimyo, the most famous of which being Oda Nobunaga, who's the guy who gets very close to unifying Japan. But it's this, very rich historical period in Japan that lots and lots of fiction, live action TV shows, anime, video games are set in that are all about the politicking and the maneuvering between all these different groups trying to unify Japan. It's like Game of Thrones, but in actual history in Japan versus the War of the Roses in England. The setting was also inspired largely by a combination of medieval European art and Victorian art from the Celtic Revival movement. The Victorian/Celtic influence is prominent in many notable elements. You can see it in the proper nouns, which is where I feel extremely confident it comes from. So Silky Mao, the Aeferario that summons Show Zama and the other Upper Earthers to Drake's side. She's almost certainly inspired by the Selkie, which is a water-based mythological creature from Celtic mythology. The one thing that Silky Mao does not do is she doesn't transform into a seal, but in every other respect, she is this fairy-like adult woman who lives in the water. Her name's Selkie, I think it's very clear. There are other proper nouns that are very clearly Celtic inspired, such as Burn Bunnings' name is very Celtic. There's one of the Aura Battlers is called the Donna Oshie, which is as Irish a name as you get. And then even more Irish is the one that's just called the Leprechaun. There is an Aura Battler just called the Leprechaun. So again, I feel like the Celtic influence, beyond just the aesthetic thing, which we can get into later, is very clear just in the proper nouns. Alongside those, the production was clearly influenced by Victorian fairy art, a movement which coincided with the Celtic Revival. Just a bit of context here. So in the Victorian period, you have the broader aesthetic movement of what we call Romanticism, which is a movement towards fantasy, fairy tales, right? A rejection of kind of the hard, cold logic of the Enlightenment period that predates the Romanticism era. And Romanticism embraces these sort of supernatural, psychological, kind of less well-defined elements and really kind of embraces those. And alongside that comes one thing, which is the Celtic Revival movement, which kind of coincides with the beginning of the Irish independent movement near the end of the Victorian period and into the early 20th century, where there's a huge kind of love for bringing in these different aesthetic elements that are Celtic and getting kind of Celtic art, Celtic mythological stories, and kind of reappropriating those. And then alongside that is this huge interest in fairies, in specifically fairy paintings, fairy stories, and by fairy stories I mean literally fairy tales in the sense of tales in which fairies exist, and the fairies kind of get backported into Celtic mythology and become more important in Celtic mythology after the Celtic Revival than they ever really were in the real deal ancient Celtic mythology. So there's this huge, big aesthetic, artistic movement in the late Victorian period involved with this. One thing that is fun to look up the Victorian fairy photograph hoaxes that existed in the late Victorian, early 20th century, where you have some girls who took pictures, very early photographs of what to a modern eye is very clearly them with a bunch of cutouts of fairies from a kid's book, but they created a whole hoax supposing it to be a real encounter with actual fairies, to the extent that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of such things as the Sherlock Holmes stories, believed in that hoax and kind of perpetuated it to a certain extent. So there's just it seems kind of quaint, or it's weird, I think, to modern people, where fairies feel very passe or whatever, but it was just a huge kind of interest in the Victorian period. And I think it is very clear to me that is one of the places where Tomino is pulling a lot of his reference, particularly if you're looking at the ending theme with the Aeferario, who is kind of dancing or jogging naked through this field of flowers, has that kind of aesthetic to me, particularly the more kind of beatific version of the fairies and the not. Because there's kind of the scary fairies and there's the beautiful fairies. Then there's kind of almost like a horror versus kind of nature beauty version of that aesthetic. But yeah, very clearly he is pulling from these kinds of sources.
If you've another animation work that people have probably seen that clearly pulls from all of this is sections of Fantasia, the Disney movie, particularly the Nutcracker Suite, and then I think it's the Beethoven piece. The way it shows fairies and stuff is from this kind of painting and stuff. So there were various points in the show I'm looking at oh, did I turn on Fantasia by accident? Because, like, particularly the opening narration and, like, the way there's, like, these, like, sparkling lights and it's panning down, you have the fairies. It does look like if you put some classical music over it, you could trick someone into thinking this is a section of Fantasia.
Yes, very much so. So one like little anecdote I found that I thought was very interesting is Tomino had Kawahara Yoshie, who for this show was a setting assistant. She becomes much more important at Sunrise later because she becomes like a screenwriter and novelist. But at this point, very early in her career, she's just a setting assistant. And so he had her buy a bunch of these necessary reference materials like art books and stuff, and all these materials they used for the aesthetic reference, but Sunrise was not willing to supply the necessary funds to buy all of these art books and shit, and so Tomino just bought them out of pocket because he wanted all these references for the show, because he was very particular about getting the aesthetic of the show down. And one other anecdote where we know this is that we have the whole section that obviously we'll really get into because it's an incredible stretch of the show, but you have the section where Show is warped back into the contemporary Japan, 1980s Japan, in episode 16, and you have that arc that goes from there to episode 19. And it's one thing that's fascinating about this is it's one of the only times in Tomino's career, or arguably like the only time truly that Tomino is depicting from a show that he like directed, other than I guess Zambot 3, contemporary Japan. Japan at the time of that he was making it, and not a near future or far future Japan. And so there's a little bit of different reference material that you get than you would normally for something like this for a Tomino show. And so when you're in regular ass Japan, he wanted to depict the actual like machinery, the helicopters, the jet fighters that the Japanese Air Force, the JSDF, had. And so he sent Kawahara Yoshie and a couple of other people to go get reference materials, and they ended up getting what was like rare at the time, access to 2 different JSDF Air Force bases to go gather like firsthand reference material for the different machinery featured in that stretch of the show. And you can see the fruits of that work because it is, I think, very notable, and it jumped out to me watching the show before I had seen this anecdote that the helicopters and jets feel super detailed for something of this period, where normally you get something that I think looks a lot more generic, where probably the reference material was maybe like a toy version or something, but here you get these very, very detailed drawings of it, and like the uniforms and the like masks and helmets that the pilots wear, all that kind of stuff is very detailed. So Tomino was very particular getting all the details of the setting right, whether it was his historical mythological influences in the fantasy side or the very grounded tactile mechanical world of the real world when Show comes back. And so it's an interesting feature of the show is those elements. One other anecdote I want to bring up here, though I'll get into, I think it's like a little bit spurious to me, is there's a couple of anecdotes about the inspiration of Dunbine being Tomino's desire to quote-unquote crush Nausicaa, referring to Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind. Now, I want to make it clear, I have not seen a thing that cites Tomino himself saying it. It is people saying that Tomino said it to them. But it's a little bit of an odd notion to me, because if you think about the timeline of this, Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, if you're thinking about the movie, that didn't release until March 1984, well after Dunbine had already finished airing. So if there is a desire for him to have that, this one-sided competition with Miyazaki we've talked about before, and a relationship between Dunbine and Nausicaa, it really only could have been with the manga version, which began serialization in February 1982, which is around the same time that Zabungle began airing. So it's like maybe in the very early chapters of Nausicaa, Tomino had some kind of influence, but when you say the like crush Nausicaa, I think people have in their head like, oh, it's Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, it's this whole thing. And that Dunbine would be in some way a reaction to that, and that would not be a realistic way of kind of thinking about this idea.
Definitely, on that overall level of it being a reaction to Nausicaa, that's just not possible. But I will say, the manga Nausicaa was immediately very popular in Japan. It was a big deal. And there's, just knowing what we know about Tomino, there's no way he didn't know about it. Like, he was almost certainly reading that manga. He had this fascination with Miyazaki. And I do think, the thing that I see in Dunbine that does look like an influence from Nausicaa is the way it depicts some of the flying machines, particularly the ones where, you have people standing and holding onto a rail and it's, got wings and they're flying around. that is like, it's so close to Nausicaa's glider. And then the other thing is some of the masks in the show and the way they cover the face and like some of the color setting is pretty similar to stuff that, and this is all stuff that is in chapter 1 right away of Nausicaa in his initial, like it would have been on the cover of Animage, the first like color drawings of Nausicaa. And there's some of that stuff that like is strikingly similar. And it's similar in part, like it strikes me because like Miyazaki doesn't really draw flying machines like anyone else, and he doesn't draw them like Tomino does, and in this show, most of it isn't like that. But there's enough of those little things that I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little influence there. But yes, overall, like, these are two parallel. But I will say, Sean, there was a point where enough of those little aesthetic things got to me, I had to pull out my phone and go, like, I need to check the dates on all this really quick and refresh myself. Like, when was this airing? And yeah, I think it's just parallel more than anything, but maybe those little couple of setting things like that.
Yes, but it's one of those anecdotes that I see people like bring up so often when I was researching the show. I'm like, I think people put a little bit too much influence on this because it doesn't feel to me, it's not like the Zabungle versus Future Boy Conan thing. Like,
that one's really clear. Slight. Yeah, this is a lot more slight. And also, like, Nausicaa and this are just in very different genres. Like, they are both fantasy. But, I mean, Nausicaa is apocalyptic fantasy. This is, like, there's just very different things, you know?
Yes. All right, so let's continue on with the rest of these notes here. So in the process of designing and fleshing out the world of Byston Well, Tomino began writing a novel set in the same world called Rin no Tsubasa, or The Wings of Rin. The novel was released in serialized chunks in the Kadokawa-published magazine Yasei Jidai, starting with the February 1983 issue, which coincided with the release of Dunbine on TV. The Wings of Rin would run in Yasei Jidai until its conclusion in 1986 and was published as separate novels in a 6-volume set. And then if you want to read them today in Japanese, there's like a 3-volume perfect version that Tomino edited in the 90s, early 2000s. While Wings of Rin is still set in the world of Byston Well, and I should say that I've certainly not read the whole fucking book because it's huge, like it's so long, but I did read like the first 30, 40 pages, whatever was like, there's like a free excerpt on Bookwalker that I just read through a couple weeks ago. The Wings of Rin is notably very different from Dunbine in a lot of ways. It is far more adult, one depicting very explicit violence and sex kind of right off the bat, in a way that certainly the show can't, though he does in a couple of scenes. Tomino gets closer to depicting like more overt like sexual encounters between characters, or it's more directly overly implied, which is something that I think you can see how the eras have kind of shifted, because it's a thing we know he's wanted to depict since at least Gundam, is be a little bit more overt about like thinking about how sexual dynamics changed certain characters, like Char and Lala's relationship in original Gundam. You get more of it in Aura Battler Dunbine, but nowhere near Wings of Rin. It's like full on explicit. Wings of Rin is also set further in the past in a region of Byston Well that is different from where we see in Dunbine, and so you do not have the same kind of geography. There is a big map, but you're not in the same countries as where you are in Aura Battler Dunbine. The main hero of Wings of Rin is a World War II kamikaze pilot, Sakamizu Shinjiro, who is summoned to the world of Byston Well in the middle of a dogfight over the Pacific Ocean. And so since that setting is well before Dunbine, there are no aura battlers, there are no aura machines, all the mecha elements are absent. It's much more straightforwardly fantasy. And so like the aura power stuff is less about you're piloting aura machines, but like the Wings of Rin itself are like a legend in this world about the Seisenshi, or the Holy Warrior, being able to activate their aura power, and they're kind of more like Mercury's, the Roman gods, or Hermes's wings on his ankle, and that kind of stuff. So it's very different in a lot of ways from Dunbine, and very, very intentionally, but it is part of his process of creating and designing and thinking through the world of Byston Well, is he wanted to explore it as a book as well. The Wings of Rin does receive an anime OVA adaptation, and we will get into that. And I assume we'll have a bigger discussion about the broader world of the other Byston Well stuff when we get to Wings of Rin and Garsley's Wing, which are two other anime OVA sort of versions of other Byston Well stories that Tomino gets to much later in his career. And in general, it just should be noted, Byston Well is kind of a small thing in Tomino's career as an animation director. It's only this show and a couple of those smaller OVAs he does later on, but it's a very big thing in his career as a novelist, and it's kind of his defining work as a novelist, where either, generally speaking, it is he adapts an existing mecha show that he had done, like the Mobile Suit Gundam novels, Zeta Gundam, Char's Counterattack, so on and so forth, or he is writing something that is set in the world of Byston Well. And so the other Byston Well books are, obviously you have Wings of Reen, you have Garzy's Wing, you have Aura Battler Senki. That is the only one that is actually an adaptation of elements from Aura Battler Dunbine, and then also the story Fao Fao Monogatari. So, and it should be noted, Wings of Reen and Garzy's Wing are big. They are like huge fucking books. And so it is... unfortunately, we do not have the time or the ability for some of these to be able to cover all of Tomino's novel stuff, but it just should be noted, if you're thinking about Byston Well, that is really the realm of his career where Byston Well is much more fully featured.
I mean, it is by far the, like, property he's returned to most other than Gundam, right?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, so, like, and that's really interesting because it is such a rich setting. The setting is like the defining thing of this show, and it does not surprise me because I had known other stuff that Byston Well is the place he'd returned to in other places, and as soon as you start watching Dunbine, you realize why this is something that fascinates him.
Yes. But with the production of Dunbine, Tomino struggled with the show a lot, which I think makes sense because he's making a show that has kind of no clear precedent. Tomino was highly critical of the first episode, which he both wrote and storyboarded. Upon viewing the finished episode, he criticized himself for making the show, quote, purely based on his own interests. So not a thing to like grab other people, but just like a thing because he wanted to make it and wanted to explore this world, basically. At that point, Tomino began making substantial changes to the structure of the show. One major change in the story that shifted multiple times over production was the point at which Show, the main character, returns to the normal world, contemporary Japan. The original idea was the ending for the show would be Show himself. It makes it complicated to talk about this character.
Yes.
In the show, Show opens the Aura Road and returns to his world at the very end of the series, would have been the original ending. Later, that got shifted to being a thing that happens at the beginning of the third core. And then after, this is different than, a little bit of spoilers. We will get into more real world stuff in the second half of the show. What I'm talking about here is not the version of what it is in the second half of the show. That is a different thing. So it would have been more like what we saw in episode 16 would have happened at the point of the third core. After realizing the show wasn't what he felt it needed to be after watching that first episode, he dramatically changed up the structure of the show to move it way up to happening at episode 16, the episode Skies Over Tokyo, creating the arc that's going to wrap up our discussion of the show today. Tomino also made changes to other elements, things like other characters changed. Notably, there's a big character we'll see in the second half of the show named Ciela, who was originally designed to be kind of like a wizened old sage Gandalf-looking character, and then you changed that to be this like beautiful young queen to kind of like try to make the show a little bit less kind of down Tomino's rabbit hole and kind of appeal to a broader market. And so that's some of the shifts that happened. And there's other stuff that we'll get into that changes in the second half that I didn't want to put in the notes because it's a bit too spoilery.
I do think that it both blows my mind, but also makes total sense that the events of like episode 16 through 19 were moved up because, I mean, the thing about isekai stories now is that is the tradition usually, is going back at the end of the story or arc or whatever, what have you, right? Like, if you just use Sword Art Online as the model for the modern isekai, the original like season is they're stuck at the beginning and then they get out at the end and then another story starts, right? And the movement there, like that early in the show, is a huge surprise. And I think it also like immediately plants a flag of this show doing something really fascinating with the way it uses its genre to kind of defamiliarize the real world for us. And it immediately makes Dunbine feel both like a precursor to a lot of other things and just vastly ahead of its time. There's something about that structure that like unlocks the show for me, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. It is just like, it's so just sort of like jolts you out, and we'll get into it when we talk about it, but just like where it's placed, I think structurally amongst like the way the show structures its story arcs and stuff like that, it's pretty wild. And I think it's one of the kind of strong, like a really strong choice he made, because I do think that it just invigorates the show in a really powerful way by moving it up versus having it happen right near the end or at the very end of the show.
Yeah.
One thing that's a little note here for the ending of a long struggled tale across these first era of Tomino shows is Dunbine would serve as Tomino's last work, sponsored by the rather ill-fated toy company Clover, which we have talked about before. Clover was one of the main sponsors and merchandising companies for Standbot 3, Daitarn 3, Gundam, and Zabungle. It's basically everything other than Ideon. And we talked about, particularly the Gundam episode, that Clover had a complicated history with trying to merchandise Tomino's shows, that they're the victims of Tomino's shows being popular with a much older demographic than the demographic that Clover makes toys for. And so this is the company that totally misread the merchandising strategy for Gundam, and kind of had that kind of, their cake eaten by other people.
Again, it will never not be funny to me in like the saga of corporate history that Clover pays for Gundam,
yes,
but then Bandai benefits from it so much that they eventually buy Sunrise and are just making, collectively over the years, hundreds of millions off of this company, and Clover went bankrupt. It's like,
yes,
it's nuts when you think about it in history.
Yes, this is where Clover went bankrupt. So their Tomino merchandising woes continue with Aura Battler Dunbine. Tomino was given a lot of freedom in how he designed Dunbine. Like at this
you
point,
don't say, Sean.
Yes, Tomino's a rock star, right, in his world of TV anime, and so they're giving him a huge leash. And so that went for the design of the mecha as well. Obviously goes off like in a totally like different crazy direction compared to everything else around it. To fit the fantasy theme, Tomino pushed for these very unconventional designs. And so the Aura Battlers were much smaller than mechs normally were, right? Like they're very tiny compared to what we think of as mechs. There's a lot of examples of mechs of this size now, but at the time this was basically unheard of. And one of the reasons why is we have a quote from the designer of the original Aura Battlers, Miyatake Kazutaka, that Tomino told him that he wanted them small so that people could tell the face of the main character when the human and mecha figures were lined up together. So he was kind of, Tomino, picturing in his head putting all these together. It reminds me of some of the quotes we had on Ideon of Tomino thinking about like designing these things and their relationship to the merchandise, because, we talk about Tomino as kind of a crazy person because he is a crazy person in many ways, but he is clearly also cares about the success of these shows and wants them to be successful enough that he can like do them. And so he is really thinking clearly deeply about their relationship with the merchandising and stuff, because that's Papa's money. That's how you get your fucking show made, all that kind of stuff. And so he's not like ignorant or trying to ignore it. He is thinking about how those things work and is trying to do something interesting with it. But in pushing for more unique designs, it ends up going to a bit of a double-edged sword direction, where Miyatake was inspired by a fantasy image he saw of people riding on the back of a giant beetle. And so he created a design for one of the Aura Battlers using a beetle motif. And Tomino liked it a lot, and so that became the fundamental design aesthetic of the Aura Battlers. They're sort of insectoid. They've got big carapaces. The wings are the most distinctive thing, that they are straight up just beetles' wings. And I think it's important to note, if you're, that beetles have a very notable place in Japanese pop culture, which if you've watched enough anime and shit like this, you should know that, where the idea of catching beetles at like sunset and stuff is basically shorthand for the thing what school-age boys did during summer vacation in the Showa era. However, that interest in beetles was not trendy at the time that they were making Aura Battler Dunbine. It was kind of coming out. Beetles would come back again in the 90s as like a big thing, but it was not like the hip thing for like young boys to do, like it was for the childhood of all the people making the show. And so a lot of the people making the show were actually very surprised when the toys were not well received by the audience, because they were like, well, this is young boys, they love fucking beetles. And they just sort of hit a window where unfortunately they just totally whiffed on it. And to Clover's credit, they were reportedly apprehensive about the designs, and they asked Kawase Toshifumi, who was one of the designers for the shows, they asked him, do you really think that these will sell, when you visit their offices? But the Sunrise producer Yamamoto Eiji, which was with him, said, no, they will definitely sell. And Clover was right. They did not sell at the time. Well, both sides were right. Clover was right that they didn't sell at that point. The Sunrise guy was right that they would sell. It's just, it would take a while. Like fine wine, you gotta wait a bit, and then eventually Dunbine's figures will become very successful just later.
I also think like the beetle-inspired design, which makes these mobile suits really round and like personified, that becomes a pretty dominant model of a lot of mecha design later on. Like, this feels super modern in its mecha design. It like definitely presages a lot of later Gundam, but other shows as well. Like Evangelion, I think, owes a lot to what they do here. And so, like, this would be very popular. You think of the 90s as an era where this kind of stuff comes back. That's also when Pokemon becomes big, which is that idea of going out and, like, catching things in the wild. But yeah, I guess they just missed the window, which is too bad, because these designs are fucking rad. I feel like if I was a kid watching this, I'd want to go buy if I was a kid, I would like, as an adult now, to go buy all the toys based on Dunbine. They're cool.
Yes, I absolutely love the designs. I think it's awesome because, again, that kind of bioorganic fused with technology aesthetic is huge in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I do think, like, it's one of 1,000 places where Dunbine is just wildly ahead of its time, wildly out of step with, like, everything else going on around it. But its designs, I think, hold up really well because they are very unique, and yeah, I absolutely love them. Though it is a weird thing when you come from playing Super Robot Wars, all the things in Super Robot Wars are a little bit kind of chibi-fied or kind of SD versions in terms of how they're animated. And so they're even more round. And so the Dunbine designs work really, really well in Super Robot Wars. And it did take a little bit for me to get used to, like, oh, wait, that's just like a big thing with like regular proportions. It's not a little chibi thing. But yes, no, the designs are awesome. But unfortunately, at the time, they were not particularly well received, despite having substantial buzz as being the new Tomino show post-Gundam. And, like, all the magazines like New Type are just having 1,000 different specials on the new Tomino show and all that kind of stuff. Like, this show is hyped up as fuck, like all Tomino shows were at this time. The show itself struggled. Most notably, it struggled in its merchandising sales. When those designs failed to resonate with the young boy demographic Clover was creating their toys for, which Clover was just very used to this at this point. So, I don't know what they're expecting. It's like, they've been burned a lot, and yet they keep touching the stove. Clover had been financially struggling for a while, having failed to fully capitalize on the explosion in interest in model kits generated by Gundam, and so Dunbine missing the financial mark was the last straw, and Clover did officially go bankrupt halfway through the show's production. Now, that's a big fucking deal, because a series primary sponsor going bankrupt is practically unheard of, and would in any reasonable world lead to the cancellation of your show, because how are you going to make your show if the people giving you the majority of the money are no longer part of that production company? And so Dunbine really lucked out in that, once again, Big Daddy Bandai stepped in. They were like, we made a lot of money on this Gundam shit. Like, let's go. And so they became the overall main sponsor for the show. And then the toy company Tomy, who had done the Ideon toys, they came in and they took over some of the merchandising as well. Specifically, they released the model of the Billabine, which that is, we haven't seen it yet, but that is Show's new Aura Battler, which will appear in the second half of the show. Before going out of business, Clover did ask for certain changes to be made to the show, but those don't manifest in the second half. So part of our notes for the second half of the show will cover some of the things that the direction of the show shifts, partially based on things that Clover wanted to have happen. Unfortunately for them, they went bankrupt before any of that shit even happened. Whether or not it would have changed their fortunes, they never saw the light of those changes in the show itself.
Can we just note that, like, as much as this season we've been chronicling, the sometimes hard, contentious road it took for Tomino to get to full artistic freedom, also a lucky motherfucker. There's just something about, like the fact that Gunpla took off when it did. Some of this is right place, right time. Some of this is like being, obviously he's making amazing art that is resonating with people. Some of it is just fucking luck. And it's like, we're all benefiting from it, getting to watch the stuff. But that's, I don't know of another example, Sean, of a show, at least that's only, a year long, where the sponsor just has to fully change halfway through. That's not a thing that happens,
Yes. I mean, if it had happened just a couple of years earlier, the show would have been canceled, like, immediately. It's only because we are in this post-Gundam explosion of interest in this kind of stuff that this occurred. It's like Dunbine is extremely lucky. Lots and lots of shows have been canceled over way less than the sponsor going bankrupt partway through production. But when we're talking about these difficulties, I do want to emphasize that I'm only talking about Dunbine at the time of its release, because the legacy of the show, if you take the longer view of it, is much brighter. There are new high-quality models of Aura Battlers continue to be produced, and they frequently sell out all the way to this day, right? It is like a very popular property amongst collectors of these kinds of figures and model kits. It's very well known and liked amongst mecha fans. It is one of the most frequently and heavily featured series in the Super Robot Wars franchise of games. It's in a shit ton of them. And you can tell its popularity, amongst a certain sector, because there even was an original game developed for Aura Battler Dunbine made in 2000 for the original PlayStation, which is 18 years after Dunbine's original airing. Which is not a thing that typically would happen for show. Where, keep in mind, it's not like there's a bunch of new Dunbine animated content. There's like a couple of other things that happened in the late 80s. There's a kind of half pseudo-sequel OVA series, not directed by Tomino, so we're not going to cover it. But, like, there's a little couple of extra things with Dunbine. But Dunbine itself is not a big ongoing franchise, and yet the toys and stuff keep coming back. There was enough interest for them to make a whole big game that's very well liked amongst the fans in 2000. So Dunbine in the broad view of history, a very successful show. At the moment of his creation, however, not so much. And indeed, my favorite quote here that I found talking about this idea is from Kawahara Yoshie, who I mentioned earlier as a setting assistant on the show. She's became a novelist and a screenwriter working for Sunrise, and in that capacity, she was interviewed, and they asked her some questions about Dunbine, and in that interview, she said, quote, "It was like an experimental work which was 2 steps ahead diagonally of the times," which is a great way of describing
That's Dunbine. So good.
It's so perfect, because it isn't just ahead of the time, it is diagonal. It's just a little bit off and a little bit odd. She says, "It was a dragon we never fully tamed. I mean, if we want to sound cool, we can describe it as a prototype. But from the perspective of working on the show, I feel like I spent a year trying to figure out how you can handle the reins on this dragon-like mysterious creature and never quite got there." And I feel like that's like the definitive statement on the production of Aura Battler Dunbine, basically.
2 steps ahead diagonally would be a great name for a biography of Tomino. Like, just, yes. That is his career, I think. That is perfect.
It's very wild. I do have a couple of miscellaneous notes I want to hit here. This first one, it was inspired by you, Jonathan, sending me a text about a week ago.
Can I just say, so this is, I'm watching you and I are both, I think, watching the Sentai Filmworks Blu-ray, which visually, beautiful Blu-ray. Yes. Looks really good. Sound is good. The subtitles are mostly fine, but they were bugging me because I realized early on, like, none of the names match, and I started listening closely, and then I was looking up the katakana to be like, what are they actually saying? Because the one that really bugged me is the character that they call Elmali in the subtitles, and they're saying Limulu or Rimuru, but it's really, they're doing the L more than the R in Japanese. And I'm like, well, that's not right. And then I'm like, it's not Neil, it's Ni. They're just saying Ni. Like the knights who say Ni. Like that's what they're saying. And there's a bunch of those in here. And it's pretty rare at this point in history to get that. That's like old school, like Funimation style, like changing names in subtitles. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And I finally texted you, Sean, because you were doing the research for this episode. And I'm like, have you found out anything? And then you had, so tell us about it.
Yes. So the show, Aura Battler Dunbine, did receive an official English dub and release on DVD in 2003. This was not like a Toonami show or anything. It was just a home video release through the company ADV Films. This localization was directed by Karl Machek, who is very famous in the English anime community as being the creator of, quote-unquote, creator of the Robotech project, which is, I'm not going to get into all of it here if you don't know what it is, but basically it's a project where they cut together elements of various different anime series into a new original show, and is the reason why, if you're a fan of Macross, it is just a massive fucking pain in the ass every time you're trying to find any Macross shit, and it just gets very confusing. And so Karl Machek, did bring a bunch of anime over, and you can give him credit for that, in helping popularize the form over here. But also it is that like very controversial era of bringing these over and making lots of notable changes. Now, Dunbine did not get like hacked to pieces or anything. It was the show. So it's not like a terrible dub, but it is that era where they are doing things like changing proper nouns and stuff. So the English dub, which if you look at the credits, employs a variable who's who of the English dub actors from the Houston, Texas scene of the time, including, I watched one episode of the dub just out of curiosity because I felt like, well, I got to now that I have to put this note in. And you do have who we now know as anime convention sex pest Vic Mignogna, has just the worst fucking quote-unquote Irish accent. He's playing Ni, and it's really hard to get through. Most people's accent work is not good, to be clear. His is like the most painful to listen to, and that's beyond him, again, being an anime convention sex pest. But for this release, many of the names were slightly altered. The localized names from this dub are, for the most part, used in the 2018 Sentai Filmworks, the /High Dive release, which is the release if you're watching it now. Almost certainly you're seeing, whether you're getting the actual Blu-ray or you're watching something torrented online, it's probably going to be these subtitles. But one thing that's weird is that it isn't every single proper noun. It's just most of them, but some of them aren't the dub localized names. It's a little weird. But this is why those romanizations of names can get very confusing when you look things up. The big ones for me are Ni gets turned into Neil, and Rimuru gets turned into Elmali, which they say as Emily in the show as well. They don't even really pronounce it as Elmali, and it's very confusing.
I want to say, like, just to be
Go
clear,
ahead.
like, I don't blame the dub for that. Those are names you need to change. You're just not going to be able to do some of those names in English. It's like in Dragon Ball, Kuririn becoming Krillin is fine because you're not going to be able to act the name Kuririn in English. It's hard.
Yes.
So I understand going Neil, going Emily, or Elmily, whatever you want to call it. It's just that shouldn't make it into the subtitles because if you're listening to what they're saying, it breaks your brain a little bit.
Yes, it's very confusing. But Super Robot Wars Y, which came out last year, is the most recently officially licensed product that features these characters. And in Super Robot Wars Y, they use what are the more traditional romanizations like NIE for Ni, RIML for Rimuru. Though honestly, I would just have Rimuru be the full Japanese RIMURU because that's also the name of the main character from the I Was Reincarnated as a Slime show, and it just sort of, I don't know, it puts a smile on my face. Be like, oh, I don't know if that guy was a big fan of Dunbine or something, but I've never encountered that name anywhere other than this and the Slime show. So,
in my handwritten notes, I was just doing stuff like basically by ear, so I wrote it as Limulu because like those L, it's more L than R in how they say it, but they're nonsense names, you know, Ni, Limulu, Rimuru, however you want to say it. They are Tomino names, and this show has the Tomino namiest names of all time.
Oh, it's crazy. One interesting thing, though, is that Super Robot Wars Y does retain Show, the main character's name, being spelled with a W at the end as opposed to U, which would be the more standard romanization. I like that. There's something because on the topic of Tomino names for a second, I do love that even though the main character is just a contemporary Japanese person who's supposed to have a contemporary Japanese name, it is a Japanese name, but it is the Tomino version of a Japanese name.
Yes.
Show Zama or Zama Show is such a fucking wild name. And so I do think defamiliarizing it a little bit with a W at the end, especially because all the people from Byston Well refer to him with an English name order, so they call him Show Zama, which is notable because then when he goes back to the real world, his parents, of course, in like the Japanese military, call him Zama Show, which would be the regular order of his name. But there's something about it that it feels like it should have that W at the end. So that's one thing I like.
Yeah, technically you'd write it like SHOU or SHO with the line over it to indicate a long O, and that would be the like Japanese, that sounds like a real name. You put the W on the end, and now it is a fantasy name, and I think that is, so like in my notes I wrote it with the W just because that sounded right.
Yeah. While we're talking about weird and sort of annoying little tiny things about names in this show, this is yet another Tomino show where the title is a little bit more complicated than you would think. And so the official Japanese title of the show is Sei Senshi Dunbine, which would literally translate to Holy Warrior Dunbine, or if I was in the localization scene, I would call it Paladin, because that's just what we call a Holy Warrior in English, and if more D&D shit in fantasy is always good. However, you might notice if you watch the opening theme and the eye catches and things like that, it does say Aura Battler in English, and of course they say Aura Battler in the show. So the way the title is stylized sort of implies to me that Aura Battler is how you would say the kanji for Sei Senshi, because Sei meaning holy, being attached to aura, Senshi battler. It's not like a regular translation of Sei Senshi, but it's a totally like cromulent version of it. So it's like, that makes sense to me. However, those two words are distinct words that are used differently in the text of the show, which is a thing the subtitles sometimes have a hard time translating. So the Sei Senshi in the show is referred to, or is used to refer to the warriors themselves, the pilots, almost exclusively used to refer to the upper earthers. So some characters like Goralia like are trying to be a quote unquote Sei Senshi. And so it's this kind of like honorific, like heightened warrior kind of title. And then the Aura Battler term in English is used specifically by the characters to refer to the aura machines that they pilot, what have the swords and shoot the guns and all that kind of shit. And this does create like a weird issue where the translators typically just have to figure out how do you translate Sei Senshi versus Aura Battler, and they typically just go with translating Sei Senshi as just the word battler with a capital B. This is most notable in episode 19. It's the main reason I'm even bringing this up, is because in episode 19, King Faizon introduces Show to his men as a Sei Senshi, and that's when they all like applaud, and it's like he's this great warrior who has returned. And the dubs / the subtitles have this awkwardness where the subtitles just call him a battler, and he's being introduced as a battler, and that's like doesn't quite jive with me. It like is a slightly weird term. I kind of get where there's a complication here, but the just calling him a battler is a little bit weird to me.
this is where using the term paladin would be perfect, because that is our equivalent word. It would make sense. It would be separate from the Aura Battler, and I think it would convey the right thing to the audience of someone with a special title. And Battler does not sound like a special title, because I thought that was weird too, Sean. Because like even the way they say senshi is like it's like a rarefied word in the world, and the subtitles just don't get that across.
Yes, and so it's not as weird as when we're talking about Space Runaway Ideon, but I do think it's funny that like all of Tomino's shows from this period have some weird asterisk when you're talking about the title, because there's like 3 or 4 different versions of it. And that's what it is for Dunbine. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the crew of the show. Director, of course, as always, is our good friend Tomino Yoshiyuki. Original story credit for Tomino Yoshiyuki and Yatate Hajime. So it's, your classic credits for a Tomino show. Character design here, once again, is Kogawa Tominori, who, obviously is the same designer as Ideon, same designer as Combat Mecha Zabungle. And just as a note, his Studio Bibo, which we talked about with like the Ideon Be Invoked movie, as being like the place where a lot of the real animation work was done. That continues with Dunbine as well. So if you look at the credits, you'll see Studio Bibo credited. If you look at a lot of the animators, a huge number of them work at Studio Bibo. So it's not just Kogawa being the character designer, it's also him being kind of like the lead of the animation team in some ways, because it's his studio doing a lot of the bulk of the animation work. Mechanical design is a pretty interesting one on this show. So we've got Miyatake Kazutaka. Miyatake is a member of the group Studio Nue, which we've talked about before. They're one of that group that's like a kind of brain trust almost, that's really instrumental to the sci-fi anime of the 70s in particular. But they become even more famous in 1982, because that is when the studio goes from just working on other projects and creating their own original show, which is a show you might have heard of, Super Dimension Fortress Macross. We have talked about Studio Nue before, specifically in the context, just as a reminder, as the creator of Dirty Pair, Takachiyo Haruka, the writer. He's one of the founding members of Studio Nue, along with Miyatake. So again, they're just like really foundational to sci-fi anime of this whole period. Miyatake had done designs for many of the notable 70s mecha shows not called Gundam, including he did do the main ship on Zambot 3, which we mentioned him in that podcast as well. As mentioned earlier in the notes, Miyatake was the one who created the fundamental beetle aesthetic of the Aura Battlers and brought that design to Tomino, who then approved it. And he designed all the original kind of set of Aura machines, but Miyatake left the show partway through production. Most likely, I don't have a statement of exactly why, but if you look at the timeline, I assume he left the show because Studio Nue made a new show, Super Dimension Century Orgus, and around the time that Miyatake left, that show was starting up, and he did the main mecha design work for that show. So I assume that's what happened. But that means that the later machines are largely designed by 2 people, either Kogawa Tominori, so when we get to the second half and we see the Billabine, that is a Kogawa design. And the other major designer that comes in is another really big name, is Izubuchi Yutaka. Izubuchi is well known now for his work on a wide range of popular series. In the world of mecha, and most notably, he is one of like the main people behind Patlabor, and one of the people who like owns the IP of Patlabor basically, and was the designer on that. For the world of fantasy, he was the character designer and illustrator for the novels of Record of Lodoss War, which is like one of the most seminal works of Western fantasy in Japanese pop culture. And his design of Dietlit, who is the main elf character, this kind of elven swordswoman, is like one of the most influential character designs in that whole genre. If you look up Dietlit or look up the designs of Record of Lodoss War, they will be very familiar to you as what do D&D characters look like in anime? It is the characters of Record of Lodoss War. And then in the relatively more recent, in the 2000s, he's the creator and director of Razafon. So Izubuchi, really big guy. This is a very early point in his career, though. He had done a little bit of work. He had done, for instance, a little bit of the kind of guest design work for some of the enemy walker machines on Combat Mecha Zabungle. But his work on Dunbine here is much more sort of like widespread and kind of full-throated, where he does a lot of the designs in the second half of the show. So we haven't seen many. We have seen some of Izubuchi's designs. We have not seen many of them yet, but that will become a bigger thing in the second half of the show.
That's awesome. I love all of those designers. So like I'm excited to see what some of them do in the second half too, because these are very, very talented people.
Absolutely. In terms of scripts, the script credits are actually kind of interesting on this one. We have 2 people we've heard and been with for a while, Watanabe Yuji and Tomino Tsukihiro. They were, for instance, some of the main writers on Space Runaway Ideon. They will be 2 of the main writers on Heavy Metal Elgime, but they are with the exception of the first episode, which is scripted, credited to Tomino, the two writers on the show. And they basically trade off 4 to 5 episode stretches and kind of hand it off to each other. And it's a pretty interesting way to do it. Like, I just can't think of any other show I've seen that has that structure where you just have kind of 2 main writers. Obviously, in the background, you have Tomino is there putting in his fucking crazy dialogue. But obviously they're doing a lot of work for the show as well, and just having them kind of trading off back and forth is pretty interesting. In terms of the art director role is Ikeda Shigemi. Continuing on, he was the art director for Combat Mecha Zabungle as well. He will continue to be one of the main people we talk about with Tomino because he is on a huge number of Tomino's shows. He's on various projects all the way through Overman King Gainer. But he is also someone who is very big in the world of Gundam outside of Tomino stuff. He was the art director for Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny. He was the art director for War in the Pocket. He was the art director for 08th MS Team, because he was also that on like Zeta Gundam, for instance. So they kind of brought him from that project and put him onto these other Gundam shows. Sadly, he did pass away very recently because he passed away in October 2024. But this is a show where, you know, the art director role I think is really huge because the backgrounds in this show are just stunning and are so big in defining the look and aesthetic of Byston Well. So I particularly want to shout out his role on this show because I think it's one of the things that makes it really striking.
Yeah, if you didn't shout it out, I was going to, because I had to, at a certain point, stop myself constantly writing in my notes, oh my god, these backgrounds, because it was just getting repetitive. But, like, truly, oh my god, these backgrounds. The skies in particular, and the range of colors he uses, it's like pink and blue and orange, like, slightly off from how you would draw Earth skies, but, like, enough that it's not Earth, but it is different, and it really feels like another world, and it's just intoxicating. But then also all of like the deep, dense forests and stuff, like, makes sense to me that he was also the guy who did 08th MS Team, because that show has really terrific use of like settings and backgrounds, and this show has some of that as well. And just, yeah, it is like one of the principal reasons to watch Dunbine is for its background work is phenomenal.
Yeah, and I do think like Dunbine's like whole aesthetic just to me is like immediately iconic. And you know, and I got that just from playing Super Robot Wars, where some of the stuff in the game uses some of these shots of like some of the more high level attacks, kind of change the background to look like Byston Well, and you get those just sort of like weird big trees or whatever of like towers of this like sort of stuff shooting up into the sky. All the stuff of how they depict, like in, I think it's episode 9 or 10, where they go to the world of the Aphrario, which is up in the sky, in the sea that is suspended above them, and like the deep sea life combined with these fairies, all that stuff, like it's fucking wild. And whether you're looking at the sort of more kind of relatively mundane medieval European stuff, or you're getting to the more extreme weird fantasy shit, I think like the art in the background, just like there's a whole gamut of it that's incredible. And there's an episode that I've watched in the second half that we haven't got to yet that also where like the backgrounds are just like, oh my god. it's like the background's almost like a character on the episode. And there's a couple in this one as well. There's like one episode where a lot of it is set like at sunrise when they're in the forest, and there's a big battle over the forest, and it almost looks like Yavin 4 in Star Wars or something, and it's just really beautiful. So the art direction, the background work, all that is just really instrumental in making the show look as good as it does, and divining the whole aesthetic and bringing you into this kind of fantasy world. One other credit we've got here is, of course, our music, which is Tsubono Katsuhiro. He's pretty interesting because he has almost no credits in TV/movie outside of Dunbine. He's just got 2 other ones. If you dig a little bit deeper, you can find he did an animated special in 1981 called Run Melos, and a movie in 1982 called Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. So in the stretch, the only time he did TV movie soundtracks was just 1981 to 1984. January 1984 is when Dunbine finished. And he's done nothing outside of that in that specific space. But if you go and like kind of look around and dig around at the Japanese internet, he has this like really huge wide-ranging career, just not in sort of like you don't go out and buy a CD with his music on it kind of thing. Like, he's a composer, he's a conductor for professional orchestras, he's a professor that teaches music, he's the director for like various music outreach programs. So it feels like he's like the kind of guy who maybe like this kind of, he didn't, something about the kind of like professional capitalist world of producing music in that sense didn't kind of fit him. And instead he's just has this big, huge career, for a decades long career in the music scene in Japan. And I imagine if you're a like professional musician working in that kind of scene, I wonder like if he's a fairly well-known dude because he's got this massive career. It's just not in this specific kind of slice of music that we talk about. And I don't think the music is like one of the best soundtracks for a Tomino show, but I do think it's quite good. And there are some tracks that I really love, particularly some of the battle music I think is really, really, really good. But it's absolutely the
right soundtrack for this show. And, you know, stuff like honestly, this sounds like I'm damning with faint praise, but I mean it, like, sincerely. One of my favorite parts of every episode of Aura Battler Dunbine is just the little prologue with the narration about the soul, like, Byston Well being where the soul comes from, and the, like, animation of the fairies, and that piece of music that plays there is so good. There's something about, like, that repeated opening that, like, sinks you into the show every time, that, like, transitions you out of the world you're living in into the world of Byston Well. And the music is a really crucial part of that. And so it's a little unlike any anime score I've ever heard. It's really good.
Yeah, because I mean, like with everything else in the show, there's no like reference point. There's no this is what fantasy music sounds like in Japanese anime. You know, Sugiyama Koichi hasn't composed the scores for Dragon Quest yet. And so it's like he is kind of having to kind of go off and do something that's a little bit more original, and in this more kind of fairy tale space. That stuff is really good. And I do love some of the action themes that get a little into like it's a little bit of electric guitar pieces that kind of come in. Like, I think the instrumentation is good at having your more traditional instruments to evoke that fantasy feel, but just putting in that extra little bit of modern instrumentation as a little bit of a spice, but only in certain places. Like, I think it's a very well-designed score, even if, again, I wouldn't put it up there with like Yoko Kanno in Turn A Gundam or Sagisu in the Zeta Gundam score. It's like not quite to that level, but it's very good. What is at that level, in my opinion, though, is the opening theme, which is Dunbine Tobu, performed by Mio. We know her, we love her from her work on the insert songs from Zabungle. She's now here doing both the opening and the ending themes. The song is composed by Amikura Kazuya, who's just a big like J-pop composer. If you look at his career, like all these big J-pop songs, with lyrics once again written by Tomino Yoshiyuki in his pseudonym of Iyogi Din. And Dunbine Tobu, I have listened to this song maybe like 1,000 times, I don't know, because it plays when you do an attack in Super Robot Wars as one of the Aura Battler or Dunbine characters. I fucking love this theme so goddamn much. I just think it hits so hard. And it is like a completion of a trend that we saw like Zabungle kind of start, and now it's here, where it's like really interesting how modern the song feels as an anime song, where we are like fully out of that era of the like anime song as a distinct genre that is like a particular kind of music, which is like the opening theme for Gundam or whatever, you know, it's like this very particular kind of genre that doesn't really exist in popular music of the late 70s outside of anime or like Ultraman shows and stuff like that. And here, Dunbine Tobu feels like this is just a sick J-rock song of the early 1980s, and you could just listen to it like that, which is very much what the anime song thing becomes throughout the 80s and obviously up to today, where it is like a good anime song is a great example of like contemporary popular music that also should like highlight or emphasize something particular about the show. And it's like Dunbine Tobu very much is that kind of song.
It's great. Particularly the first 15 seconds of this song goes so fucking hard.
Yes.
Just like the way it starts, and then the bass line that comes in. I was listening to the full version, the like album cut of the song for the first time this morning, and it is so good. The way it continues to play with that bass line and the guitar riff. And you have a note here that it was used for a while as entrance music for Japanese professional wrestler Maeda Akira, which makes sense because like the opening, I can totally see the like lights going down, light show starting, smoke coming out as like the bass line kicks in on this song. Fuck yeah.
Yeah. And like the use of horns is just so good that like accents those big hits in the song. I think like Mio's voice is just so powerful in the song, and you just have like that lead into the chorus where it's that line about like umi to daichio tsuran like the like split the earth and the ocean with your aura sword is basically what the line is, and it's so powerful. The only thing that's a bummer is that it's, you know, the TV cut of the song, and so the end of it is that like dun thing with like Show kind of jumping towards the camera, whereas in the full version of the song, the end where that happens just goes straight into a sick guitar solo. And so I always feel a little bit bummed that I feel cheated out of the guitar solo every time. It's like, just give me 10 more seconds of the song. I mean, obviously it is the right decision for the show to stop there, but I'm so used to the full version because that's what plays in Super Robot Wars that I'm like, no, where's my sick guitar solo? I want it so bad. But Dunbine Tobu, 10 out of 10, such a good fucking theme song. Kicks endless amounts of ass. And I also really love the ending theme for this show, Mieru Daro Byston Well, which basically means like, can't you see Byston Well, or you can see it, can't you, Byston Well? Which I both love the song, but also the ending animation for it is just so beautiful and so kind of like almost like intoxicating or like mesmerizing, of this fairy skipping through this field of flowers. In this like really beautiful, super elegantly and delicately animated kind of, you know, a simple loop, but because it's a simple short loop of animation, it's so perfectly done, and then concludes with that little piece of her wrapping herself into a ball in like the petals of the flower coming around her. It's like, oh my God, like that coupled with this beautiful song of this kind of very slow kind of ballad, that culminates in Mio just belting out the words Byston Well. It's so good. It's just such a...
This is Byston Well. Tomino is the only man on earth who would write his own fucking theme song where you have your amazing vocalist just belt out the name of this setting that is fully new to your show. Just, it makes Byston Well so immediately like iconic because you've got just that amazing moment for Mio to belt out the name of the place. Oh man, it would be like if J.R.R. Tolkien sent out a CD, there would have been CDs at the time, a phonograph with every copy of Lord of the Rings just singing about how great Middle Earth is. It would be awesome, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they should have done for the Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. Just over the ending credits, have Elijah Wood naked skipping through a field of flowers, and then culminate in him belting out the words Middle Earth.
Yeah.
It would have been great.
Byston Well is a better name for a fantasy world than Middle Earth. No offense, Tolkien, but Middle Earth, you know, Byston Well, that's cool.
Yes, it's, what is Middle Earth? The middle of the earth? That's nothing. Byston Well, that's by a stone well, man. I know what that is.
Or through a stone well. Anyway, man, we got a lot to talk about here, Sean.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show. So that wraps up my official notes, and this is where we can open up, Jonathan. There's a lot of places to go. We can talk about the characters, we can talk about the story, we can talk about the setting, we can have the genre talk. Where do you want to go?
You know, I want to start with just the beginning of this show, because watching a new Tomino show often feels like you are learning a new language through like immersion, like you are just dropped into the middle of a city in a country you do not live in that speaks a foreign language and just go ahead and learn it through just hearing people talk. And I feel like Dunbine has that more than any other show of his, because there's the way this show opens with, like, you don't really see our Earth. You see Show on the motorcycle, but like in this like nebulous void, and then he is in Byston Well. And the first couple episodes of this show are basically what anyone else would have done as the first core of the show, which is like Show learning about Byston Well, being with this army, learning that the army is really the bad guys, and then leaving them to go fight with the underdog, like revolutionaries, which is Nee and his group, and all of that stuff. That's like 3 episodes. And it is like the hardest whiplash of any Tomino show, is like just falling into it in a way that ultimately I think I kind of appreciate, because I think it makes the world of Byston Well feel all the more lived in and solid and real, the sense that like it feels like something that existed before this show was made because of how the show introduces it. But I also had a quality with this show where this is something that people younger than us, Sean, this is not an experience they will have had. It felt to me like I was watching a show midway through its run on TV, like as a kid.
Yes.
Like when you would start watching a show and you don't know what's going on, but you think it's interesting, so you just kind of pick it up and get into it. Even though this story does technically have a beginning, which is Show getting sucked into Byston Well through the Aura Road and kind of jumped into fighting in the Dunbine, but then he runs away with Nee. That is technically a beginning. But it is not presented in a way that really feels like that. And so it is like a really hardcore immersion into whatever the fuck this world is. And I think you can feel in some ways some uneasiness with Tomino figuring out, how do I really introduce the ideas of this show? But I also you can also feel him, I think, developing a way he's going to do this with a lot of other shows. Like, I think Turn A Gundam in particular is a more refined version of what he's doing here. But it is that idea of just like, we're going to drop you into a very foreign, dense world that is going to feel like it's been running and existing for a very long time. And you've just kind of got to get up to speed as things happen. And, you know, I find that exhilarating in other Tomino shows. I find that exhilarating here. I think the show doesn't, like, fully snap into place for me for a while, but I don't say that to say I was never enjoying it. I was, like, very hooked on it from the word go, because it is such a singular thing. But the way it introduces you to the world is just so interesting and not really comparable to anything other than maybe other later Tomino shows.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's interesting is Tomino's sort of self-assessment of that first episode in his like classically self-critical way is interesting, because his like the thing he didn't like about it fundamentally, and right, this is the thing, the experience he had at the time that caused him to change the structure of the show, was that it almost wasn't enough of what you're saying, that it was too slow. And I do think there's like an oddity, there's almost this like kind of dreamlike element to it. That I think, and for me, works for it, but I can definitely understand why Tomino, it wasn't the thing that he like kind of the ideal he wanted for the first episode, where most Tomino shows start with, you know, the classic Gundam fashion, your main character being thrown into the action like halfway through the first episode, and at that point kind of having to make sense of everything and just kind of get into it, and there's that very like kind of intense action start. And Dunbine's not that. Dunbine has this very like kind of gradual opening where you have that great ephemeral scene of Show on his bike at night, with like, you know, the headlights and all that. Such a beautiful, gorgeous scene. That was like where, you know, I've had this Blu-ray set for fucking ever, and it's just not, you know, sat down to watch the show, and my breath was just taken away immediately, because I think the opening of the show is so gorgeous looking. And then he gets summoned into Byston Well, and at that point, there's this kind of like weird stretch of time where Show is in Byston Well for a couple of days. Like, you have a couple of scenes of him sleeping there, and Cham, like the fairy sneaks into his room and stuff. And you get these like multiple scenes of him being like kind of shown through the warehouse with all the ore machines being built with shot weapon, and kind of him getting exposited to in a much more direct fashion than Tomino almost does, because Tomino is like exposition is like alien to him. But I think there's a sense of he doesn't know, for his world that is so different, that's such a different concept, that there's no precedent for this kind of setting in an anime. That I think you can feel him trying to figure out, how the fuck do I display this world that he has spent, you know, days and days and days building out this whole complicated thing, and he's writing a fucking book set in it and all this kind of stuff. And he takes this sort of other path, this slower, much more gradual pathway through it. And it's only at the end of that first episode you have a brief kind of skirmish with Marvel, Frozen, who then gives him that like little nugget of her like being like, why are you fighting for this man? Don't you understand like what he's trying to do? And shows, of course, like, I have no fucking idea because I don't know anything what's going on. But it like puts Show in this interesting place as your lead character because he's just kind of going with the flow, and you don't have the thing you expect from isekai where you have like these big reactions from the main character of him just being utterly flabbergasted by everything going on around him, and this sort of like big fish out of water. And there's this interesting thing about Show's character that I do think gets actually contextualized when you see his parents, that he's this like quiet loner who's like a little bit like off on his own island, and he's kind of like, and he is shocked, he is disturbed by all this shit going on, but he doesn't know what to do, and he's not like making waves, and he's not trying to make waves here, and he's just kind of accepting it. And it's a really interesting kind of different start while being fused with some of the Tomino-isms that you talked about of like, you aren't getting, while you get more exposition here than you do in a typical Tomino show, you're not getting the level of exposition you're getting in a normal fantasy show at all. It still is Tomino-fied, but it's just this like interesting blend, a really interesting first episode that, again, I think has this almost dreamlike quality because the main character's not acting the way you quite would expect. Long stretches of time are passing in ways that feel unusual because it just feels like it should be much more notable that the main character has spent a whole day in this world already and is just going to go sleep in this fucking room. Like, how do you go to sleep after this shit? If there's just like a strange quality to it, but I think it really, really works for the show.
I think it does ultimately too, but like it is really fascinating. And like Show as a protagonist is interesting because early on, it's actually very similar to how I think Cosmo Yuki is characterized in Ideon, where in the early going, he's not really the main character. Like, he's there, we're following him, he's maybe our point of view, but the movers and shakers of the story are other people. Like, Ni is much more of a protagonist figure in the early run of this show, particularly for, like, his relationship with people. He's the one who wants and, like, knows about this world and all of that stuff. But I think Show, as Cosmo did, does ultimately step up into that role, particularly by the end of the episodes we're talking about here. And I agree that he is contextualized in a way that reframes that opening. Because one of the questions I had watching the beginning of this show is like, how do people react to Byston Well? Because from what we see of Show, it's almost like they get there, and there's some, in that like way the narration says, like, we have forgotten our roots in this world. It's like something is awakened, and like something means that they don't question this place as much as we would expect in this kind of portal fantasy-esque story. But how much of that is just Show? How much of that is the world of Byston Well? We get the new Upper Earth people later on, and it seems like it's a little bit of both, because they also have a less muted reaction, but still more muted than you would think of like falling into a fantasy world. But like all of that feels so alien to us. And it is just such a fascinating introduction. And along with that I feel like Dunbine marks a shift in how Tomino paces his stories, where yes. Like we are fully at now what I would say is the like what I think of as like the Zeta Gundam onwards point of his stories are moving. Even, like, they've always moved faster than anyone else's stories, but now they're on, like, 2x speed. Where, like, Dunbine, the amount of dialogue, the quickness with which things happen, the number of proper nouns thrown at you, I found, like, I had to rethink how I was, like, taking notes on this show, because it got too hard to, like, look away from the screen, focus on anything else, because the amount being thrown at you, it is so dense, it is so quick. Some episodes feel like they are over just like that, just in a flash, and it feels much more like later stuff, like a Reconquista in G even, than what we've seen so far, and that also just takes recalibration, that, like, I'm learning how to watch a show again from scratch.
Oh, absolutely. And it's obviously one of the kind of main themes of our TOMINO-THON podcast is us sort of discovering all these missing links and kind of tying that chain together from our Weekly Suit Gundam, where we just looked at his Gundam shows, where this is so distinctly, the style has shifted to Zeta Gundam. And I do think it's interesting that, like, it makes that shift, it contextualizes that shift for me in a way I had never thought about. Because I think the thing that you see here is it's him pulling from this style of Warring States period drama, which in and of itself is pulling from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, because that's really what it is. It is this like really sophisticated, like, kind of omniscient narrative viewpoint that can really rapidly move amongst this range of different factions, all of whom have their own kind of political goals and ambitions. Everyone's engaged in some level of manipulation, in some level of self-discovery. And so there's this like really, really complicated web of these sort of power relationships that exist across a wide range of characters. And the narrative can shift its viewpoint very rapidly and develop all these really interesting characters. And you have this massive cast, and kind of everybody stands out in some really interesting way, even relatively minor characters, we've only seen the new Upper Earthers for a couple of episodes from what we're covering, but all of them immediately like strike you in a really distinctive way. And I do think it is like here, because it is also literally doing like siege assaults on castles and like political maneuvering between people who have like loyal vassals and retainers, and there's like a messenger is sent to the base and Drake has him beheaded, because the aesthetic of it is doing the medieval version of this kind of thing. It made me realize, like, oh, that is what it has always been. Like, that is what Zeta Gundam is. It is that kind of Romance of the Three Kingdoms style, big political drama with all these different factions. It's just set in a really different setting, which complicates it because the style of politics are unfamiliar. Or the style of politics are just like very different and very modern. Whereas here, that style of politics is in that Game of Thrones space. It is in that Romance of the Three Kingdoms space where it is very feudal. And I think that just like works really well. I think it's very exciting in this show because I think he's got a great handle on it, and like the machinations of Drake Luft, who is our like Oda Nobunaga analog, or our Cao Cao from Romance of the Three Kingdoms, that sort of like tyrant who is using his power to try to unify the land and has this kind of great ambition that cannot be quenched and is willing to violate kind of every basic commonly held principle in that world in order to do it, because he kind of looks down on these kind of antiquated norms and stuff. All of that I think lands super, super well in Aura Battler Dunbine and lends it that kind of unique style where it's fused with Tomino's sort of traditional house style that's already very fast-paced. Now you're combining it with this whole other kind of story that is fast-paced largely because you assume the audience knows those relationships. So the Sengoku era dramas, the Taiga dramas and stuff he's pulling from, or like adaptations of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, assume you have read the books or like know the history to a certain enough extent that you don't need it explained to you. And so it just like kind of moves. But here he's doing that, but it's a totally original fantasy world where it's like all the proper nouns are brand new, the map of the world is brand new, and yet he's still using that style. And it's fucking awesome. It kind of makes me think of like Miyazaki Hidetaka's famous kind of quote about his approach to designing the Souls games, which he's influenced by trying to read these English fantasy books when he was a kid, but he didn't really understand the English very well. And so it's this kind of like half putting together, it's kind of like half translated story. And it sort of feels like that, where it's so defamiliarized. But it makes it such an engaging process to watch.
100%. And I think like the another key word we could use here instead of just pace is like the density of narrative information, because that is it. If you think of like, if you put Gundam 79 and Zeta Gundam back to back, what is the big difference? Because structurally, they're actually very similar. Like the way that the episodic structure Tomino hits on with Gundam is what he uses for the rest of his career, in terms of how every episode is built around at least one little battle and kind of the where the act break goes and all of that kind of stuff. And that is still the case in Dunbine too. Like his mastery of the episodic versus serial structure has not really changed that much. It's the amount of density there. Like Gundam is big by most standards of fiction, but if you compare the cast of Gundam, which is really just the little white base crew and one or two villains at a time, versus Zeta Gundam, which is cast of thousands. I mean, it's just like you could never stop listing characters. That is the big difference. And yes, Dunbine is like a huge step there. And even like Ideon has a much smaller cast as well. It's more Gundam-sized in the number of people on screen. But this is now we're at the point where we do still have our like main little family on the ship. In this case, it would be the Zelana and and Nee's whole crew, but like the world around them is just so big. You are never going to stop seeing new crazy names and like trying to figure out relationships. And it is that density which creates an even more accelerated speed. But there is also like, and I can understand always how this could be alienating to some viewers, but for you and me, we're freaks like Tomino, so we just find it totally exhilarating because again, there is a point, and I think this is part of why going to Upper Earth at episode 16 is so smart, because in episode 19, when you get back, you have the same feeling Show does, where it's like, I speak the language now. We're back and I'm realizing how fluent I am in the language of Byston Well and the story and all of those relationships. Because you see them fresh again, the same way Show does, you realize how much you've learned and how much this show has adjusted your own kind of capacity for storytelling interpretation in those just 19 episodes, which is not a lot of anime.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great point because like in the midst of those episodes, like when you're episode 10, 11, and you're like, you're introduced to like 3 or 4 different kings that have their own retinue of different people around them and all that kind of stuff. And like there's a stretch where there's like 3 of them that are active at the same time, plus Drake and all of his people, and then Drake summons 3 new Upper Earthers. And you're like, I got to keep track of that. And then it's like, oh, Musi Poe's here again, but now she's a pilot. And it's like there's all this shit, and then you're like just removed from all of it, and the show's like a hard reset for like 3 episodes. And then once you come back into it, like you said, it's like with Show, you've realized that Byston Well is your home. Like, this is where you're supposed to be. This is where you actually belong. And you feel way more comfortable there than you do in the modern world. And I think it is one of the things that induces that effect is this incredible density of information where you feel like you're drowning for a couple of stretches of the show. Even me, who comes with like a bigger frame of reference from some of the Super Robot Wars stuff, a lot of the Super Robot Wars stuff is pulling from the last fourth of the show. And so it's some of like a lot of this stuff is stuff that I didn't even really know. So I'm like desperately holding on to like, I know Show and Cham and Marvel and Nee, and I know these people. And I know Drake and Burn Bunnings, but it's like, oh my God. And I know Todd, my boy Todd. I'll hold on to you forever, Todd. It's like, but everybody else is like, oh my God, there's all these like factions and, and like just big things happen off screen. Like Goralia ends up in a sexual relationship with the guy who shot weapons like right-hand man and stuff, where it's like there are big leaps that occur off screen, which is very Zeta Gundam-like. But you just, once you get used to it, even when you don't realize it, you are absorbing all this information and drawing these conclusions and putting everything together. And like Dunbine is absolutely the first Tomino show that is like full on doing this style like Zeta Gundam does.
Yeah, it's the kind of show where there are so many proper nouns, and Tomino never writes in that like expository way of like, hey, this is this person, here's their resume, right? So sometimes sometimes you meet a character and you don't know their name for a while. Like the 3 pilots who come in later on, you do not get all 3 of their names in one place until episode 19, and I was keeping really close track of that because I wanted to know their names. And other than Alan, I don't think you get all 3 of them until episode 19. But there's other stuff like they start talking about shot weapon, and you're going in your head, okay, is that the name of a weapon in this weapons development factory that they have here? The shot weapon? Wait, no, that's a person? That can't be a person. That's a weird... No, it's shot weapon and he's from America. Okay, we're doing this. Like, that is so much of watching, and that's a very, for me, like, kicking in old Weekly Suit Gundam, like, stuff that I'd forgotten over the years because, again, so far we've been watching earlier Tomino shows, which are dense, but they're not quite, that level, and it's just, it's like when you get to, Reconquista and G, and they're talking about Mask, and it's like, whose Mask are we talking about? No, it's his name, he's Captain Mask. And it's like, oh, okay, it's this kind of show. I don't know, there's just something about it that is so unique.
Yes, and the reveal that it's shot weapon, he's from California, and by the way, he's wearing a big evil wizard's robe.
Yes.
It's absolutely wild.
And just as I said before, talking about that first arc, what you've done, like I did with Zabungle Sean, you've split the episodes into arcs and given them very funny names. But for episodes 1 through 4, and that is the arc where, as I said, show what it would be a core in any other anime, where he gets there, he learns the ropes, he's fighting with Drake for a little bit and Burn, and then he sees the horrible things they do and leaves. I think if you took those 4 episodes, cut out the theme songs and the eye catches and put them together as like a 90-minute movie, and then showed it to someone who hadn't watched Dunbine and gone, this is the compilation movie of the first core of the show, they would go, oh yeah, it's moving really fast. I can see how this was originally 13 episodes. And then you told them, no, that's actually that's everything. I showed you 100%. It would blow their mind. Because it blew my mind just knowing it was those episodes.
Well, yeah, I mean, it blew my mind because I knew the detail in Super Robot Wars, because it's mentioned that, like, Show was part of Drake's faction, because Drake is a bad guy in Super Robot Wars Y. And so I went into this show being like, oh, well, that will be like you said, that will be like the first core or whatever. And he gets summoned by Drake and he's with Burn Bunnings. Like, okay, yeah, it's like, yeah, the episode 2, he's kind of seeing the fucked up shit that Drake's faction does. And Burn Bunning kills the woman who's the lady of the House of Givens. And then episode 3 shows like, I gotta get fucking out of this place. And episode 4 is where he fully like escapes and officially joins Nee, and that ends with him having a handshake with Nee and joining their crew. And I was like, my jaw was on the floor. I'm like, oh my God. It's like, I thought we were in for like 12 episodes of him being part of Drake's crew. And then that kind of slow realization that, oh, I'm really on the bad guy side. It's like, no, it just fucking goes in and it does it. But I think what's interesting is, like, I think you still have that sensation. Like, you still have the narrative feel of he was with Drake. He saw that world and then he had to reject it. It's like, you don't need to belabor the point. You don't need to do 10 episodes of that. You can do it in one episode, because episode 2 is the episode where that happens. It's kind of like watching Mobile Suit Gundam and you're like, oh, they just spend the one episode on the moon base, and it's just an entire season's worth of moon base episodes occurred in the course of a single episode of this TV show. Yeah.
But this is even faster than Zeta Gundam is 5 or 6 episodes before Camille, like when his parents are dead and he's truly on the ship. Captain Bright is not captain of the Argama until I think episode 9 or 10. Like, this just goes pedal to the metal. You go from Drake seeming like powerful, but you're not sure if he's powerful in a bad way or a good way. You go from that to horrific war criminal in one episode. When you get to that moment of he's blowing up the Lady of the House of Given, and then he just does this full-on just carpet bomb assault of the castle. Just like, again, it's just, and that's part of why actually Show's turn works, is that if you are new to Byston Well and you see that, it's like, yeah, I have to get out of here. This is because you have not had any of this normalized for you. It is so horrifying so quick that, like, how did Drake expect anyone to stay with him, honestly, with the Upper Earth people is, like, crazy, because he doesn't ease them into the war crimes. It is just fully, you're either going to help me exterminate this entire family line and castle or not. And Show is like, no, I'm not doing that, because Show's a good guy.
Yes. And not only are you going to exterminate all of them, but you're going to do it while you see Burn Bunnings create the fake, like, reasoning for it right in front of your eyes. And it definitely says a lot about Todd and Alan and Gerald, and I think Pham is the other one. It says a lot about those 4 fuckers. That they're just like, oh my God, you know what? It's just a nice, easy life. Like, why do I want to have to deal with this other shit? Like, I just want to live the cozy life here. In Byston Well, because it sucks back on Upper Earth, and I'm treated like a fucking hero here. And they just fucking go with it. And Show's just constantly doing his Camille beat on, like, righteous anger, like, what is wrong with you? Can't you see what you're doing? Can't you see the consequences of the violence you enact? Like, I just want to fucking chill, bro. Fuck off, is their response.
Yeah. And on that point about Burn Bunnings, I also want to say, for those wondering, we are recording this in January 2026, and if you listening to this in, like, May want to cast your mind back to what happened in America and the world in January 2026, and we're watching this show about a warlord creating all sorts of ridiculous pretexts to go to war with different places, man, this show was a little too real at times, Sean, I gotta say.
Yes, no, it absolutely is. Like, it touches that nerve of, because this is both, like, historically true and it's true now that, like, fascist people who rule with violence and power, like do so without need of justification, right? They will manufacture whatever justification. That's like Drake's whole MO, and basically everybody else who can't see that is completely powerless in the face of this guy because they're trying to play by a set of rules that he doesn't give a fuck about. And it's true of Drake, and it's also true of Byrne, right? Who's this guy who, on the face of it, espouses all these like chivalric virtues of being the knight and all this kind of stuff, and he carries himself that way. But he has absolutely no qualms about violating any of those things because those traditions and that sort of whole kind of cultural aesthetic of chivalry is just another weapon in his arsenal. And this is just like, again, it's true of history, and it's true now of that, like of the aestheticism of it, and the traditionalism is just a tool in the tool chest. There's a weapon in the armory of fascists and their ilk. It's very true here, and it's true of like all of Tomio's shows, but it's particularly potent because we're watching this one right now at this moment.
I mean, at some point I should stop being surprised at Tomino making shows that are both batshit crazy and totally finger on the pulse of the times we live in. But that is every show he's ever made, and so there you go. It still continues to surprise me because it should. I mean, it is nuts to have a show with fairies and these mechs, and they're in, ye olden times, but then also it is like this incredibly trenchant commentary on feudalism and imperialism and fascism. But yeah, that's the Tomino effect. I think like this is probably a good point, maybe, Sean, to transition into talking about the characters and some of the voice actors and that stuff. Although I also, before we did that, just wanted to have a brief conversation on the cast as a whole, because I do think one difference so far, at least for me, is that I like and I'm interested in all of these characters. I do think the emphasis is a little different than other Tomino shows. Like, I think this show has fewer characters who like pop off the screen than other ones because the setting is so foregrounded. Like, more than any other Tomino show I've seen, Byston Well is the star of this thing, and I think characters gradually reveal themselves to be very interesting. Particularly for me, I think Garalia, Byrne Bunnings, and eventually Show, like, really become fascinating to me, but it's a slow burn to get there, and overall you don't have, like, Nee does not pop off the screen in the way other captain characters do or stuff like that. And I don't say that as a criticism so much as I think his emphasis, the balance is just a little different here. Is that fair?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And yeah, I think a lot of the characters are slower burns, as you say, like to kind of like get your like deeper interest, because there is all this additional setting material that Tomino is trying to establish and all that kind of stuff. I think that's definitely true. Yeah. So let's go through the characters. Let's start with the crew of the Zelana, our main heroes here. And of course, we'll start with Show Zama, voiced by Nakahara Shigeru. Great voice actor, has been in a ton of stuff, but for us in particular, he is Android 17 from Dragon Ball Z, and he is Troa Burton in Gundam Wing, our little circus boy. And this is one where I played through most of Super Robot Wars Y, thinking that Show Zama was voiced by the same actor that voices Camille, because they have such similar. When they shout, these two men sound exactly the same. Watching the actual show, the original performance, it's like, oh no, this is very much his own character, his own thing. It obviously predates Camille, but I do think like he just immediately vibes with Tomino's style, like the dialogue. You need an actor who can do this sort of, again, that righteous fury piece of be this very grounded, real feeling person, but be able to sort of shout against the injustices of the world. And this is what Kazuma-yuki does. This is what Camille Beaton does. And this is what Show Zama does as well. And I do think I just love Nakahara's performance as Show, and the whole like kind of scope of the quieter human moments with him, but also there's these moments of sort of like, the battles and him having these sort of visions through the aura power and all this kind of stuff. I think he just carries this character so well, and I just really adore Show as a protagonist.
I do too, and I particularly like, I think, the way he comes into his own at that point where I think it's the episodes leading up to 16, where he starts taking more and more initiative, and then what happens after that, because it's, Nakahara really gets to rip the lid off and act once you get to episode 16, and he's in like, it's so interesting that it is when he is thrust into our world as the other world that he finally reacts with like terror and panic. unlike he did when he got to Byston Well, right? Like now he is like in like, oh my God, I have to like act mode. And yeah, Nakahara like definitely traces all of that really beautifully. And I did not get to the point where I actually looked it up, but the whole time I'm listening, I'm like, I know this voice. And I kept trying to pinpoint where it was from, and it is Android 17 from Dragon Ball Z, because that is such a distinctive voice performance, and I've always loved it. And yeah, it's obviously this is a very different character, but it's a great voice. I will have to say, I was not thinking of Troa Barton from Gundam Wing. No offense, Troa, you were one of the better Gundam boys in that show, but I don't think about Gundam Wing that much.
Yes, I gotta, all our Gundam boys, we gotta put in the credits when they show up.
Yeah,
and then we've got our sort of like mascot / sort of co-lead, which is Cham Fao, our Mifrario, or our fairy character, played by Kawamura Maria, whom we have talked about before, and we will talk about her again because she's in a lot of Tomino stuff, and I'll go through just a reminder of why. But just some things, she's got Lassie and Lilith Fao in Heavy Metal Elgheim. Put a pin in Lilith Fao. That character might seem familiar when we get to Heavy Metal Elgheim. She's Beltorchica in Zeta Gundam. She's Quest in Char's Counterattack. She's Jonathan's favorite character name ever, Jungfreud in Gunbuster. She's Naga in Slayers. Just to shout out another pivotal fantasy anime she's in. She's Mamiya / Eiko in Revolutionary Girl Utena. She's Asuka's mom, Kyoko Zeppelin Soryu in Neon Genesis Evangelion. And then she's Higgins Saz in Brain Powered. So that's a lot of big anime, and obviously a lot of Tomino shows. And you might be vaguely remembering her name because we have talked about her before. Because if you cast your mind way back to our Gundam episode for our Tomino-thon, you will remember that Kawamura Maria was the Lala Soon cosplayer who was selected along with her future husband and Elgheim character / mecha designer Nagano Mamoru as representatives of the fans to read the declaration of a new anime era, as like what I assume in like, and how in Doctor Who there's like fixed points in time. This has got to be like a fixed point in time in the history of anime where like 7 like fucking weird confluences of things occur simultaneously. Cham is her debut role. She was not a voice actress. She basically auditioned for it after Tomino recommended that she do so when she was interviewing him for a magazine, because she was basically like a cosplayer, almost like a professional otaku at this kind of like period in time. Her and her husband's relationship with Tomino runs very, very deep. As we mentioned in the Gundam podcast, he was the matchmaker at their wedding, and he also suggested the name Kawamura for the kanji for her stage name, which is Maria, but it's just written in different kanji, and it's like much fancier kanji. Kind of like Tomino changed the kanji for his name as a kind of a stage credit. And she and Nagano will just be an ongoing feature in various credits for Tomino shows going forward, but this is where it starts. It is her first ever voice role as Cham. And this is a character I know very well because she is all over Super Robot Wars. And it's a character that I think you can tell that Kawamura is new to voice acting, particularly early on. But Cham is this character I think that for me, like slowly over the course of the show, just kind of grows and grows in importance as her relationship with Show does. And then you get to that stretch in episode 16 to 19 where she and Show are both shuttled off to the real world together. And it just like makes you realize how much, for me, it just made me realize how much I love this character and how like charming she is and likable she is. And she is both, the comic relief kind of thing, but she also is so much the heart of the show. And I think like Kawamura Maria like carries that so well, even if I think it's a little bit rough around the edges early on. Her performance, she like really like gets into it, and there's some really huge moments with Cham in some of those episodes, like where Show is crying after basically breaking it off with his parents and kind of like cutting those ties, and she flies up to his face and wipes a tear from his eye. And I think like you just see how much tenderness is in the character and how much Kawamura has grew into her role as a voice actress, where obviously she's this like hugely successful voice actress from this point. And it like, I think says something that Tomino in just an interview with her spotted something that made him be like, you should audition for this character. And because like she has obviously had like this kind of legendary career, but it all started with this like very unexpected but very major role in this show.
I mean, she has this kind of otherworldly voice. Like, I don't know how else to say it. She does not play this part like anyone else would play this, especially someone I think who is more experienced would play this part, but it fits this character so well. And the journey that you go on with Cham over these first 19 episodes is amazing, because early on, she's effectively Haro from Gundam with a little more agency. Like she's sitting in the cockpit with the hero. She says things once in a while, but you wouldn't say she's a major character. But she grows into that until you get moments like you just mentioned, Sean, in the like Earth arc where she goes up and wipes that tear away, where like I can't pinpoint the moment I started to love Cham as a character, but I did, and I don't know where it happened. But it's like that journey is so interesting, kind of behind the scenes of everything else going on.
Yes, and she's got her big fucking 80s hair, which I love.
Yeah.
Like her massive coif of hair. Yes, and Cham, love that character, and then also love in Super Robot Wars. She's really good because she basically makes Show a very cheap character because she's the pilot, but she is also pilot, and so they get like an extra buff, and it's really good. Next up, we have our other major pilot from the Zilana and a Texas girl from Dallas. We have Marvel Frozen, played by Doi Mika. Doi has played Hayase Misa, who's the canonical love interest from Super Dimension Fortress Macross. She's the lady who ends up with Hikaru by the end of the show. She is full flat from Heavy Metal Elgheim. I don't remember off the top of my head which of the crazy ladies in Elgheim that is from Super Robot Wars, but she's full flat. She's Queen Serenity, Sailor Moon's mom from Sailor Moon, and she's a character named Kobe from One Piece. I don't know who that is.
Kobe is a very major character. Kobe is, I think, one of the only characters who talks in the One Piece anime before Luffy does, because he's in episode 1. Kobe is actually a pretty funny character in One Piece because Doi Mika still does this voice, and Kobe, over the life of that show, has a glow up from this like little scared boy into this absolute fucking hunk of a man, but Doi Mika still does the voice, but is like trying to do it it's very funny. But yeah, still does that voice 30 years later, and I was happy to hear her here. When you get to the end of episode 1 of Dunbine and you realize there's a character named Marvel Frozen, and that's not the name of an app on your iPhone where you play a Marvel game, like it's a sequel to Marvel Snap, but it is the name of a main character, and she's from Texas. Who boy, one of the funniest lines in this entire show is when Show is trying to figure out where everyone is from, and she says, Marvel reveals she's from Texas, and he goes, Marvel Frozen, it is an Anglo-Saxon name. And I'm like, no, it isn't, Show. This is not a name at all.
Well, Jonathan, you're slightly misremembering this exchange, because this is something I put in my notes. This happens in episode 2, and it's exchange between Show and Todd. And it is maybe my favorite piece of dialogue in the history of Tomino's entire body of work, which is Show's telling Todd about the woman he encountered at the end of the previous episode. And he says, I saw a beautiful woman. I think she is from your country. And Todd, in his classic Todd fashion, goes, that's the problem with you Asians. You think that everyone who's white is American. And then Show kind of mumbles to himself, Marvel Frozen. Isn't that name Anglo-Saxon, though? And I had to pause because I was laughing so hard, where this exchange is so crazy. One, like, Todd throws out his, like, racist shit, but also, like, maybe this is I'm misreading this, but to me, I don't think the thing he says is a thing that a racist American would say about Asians, because I don't think they think about Asians that much. Like, it reads to me as like a thing that a Japanese person would think that a white person would be racist against Asians towards, of this like, oh, well, you think that everyone who's white is American. I don't think that racist white American people think that all Asian people think that all white people are Americans. That's just like not a racist assumption I've ever heard in my life. But I have heard that from in like shows and stuff from Japanese people of being like, oh, they're white, they must be American. So that is like a weird thing. But then Show somehow kind of like proves his point right, because Show then is like, but it's Marvel Frozen. Surely that's an Anglo-Saxon name, which is crazy for two reasons. One, because no, Show, it's not. Like, I don't know what fucking books you're reading or what. I don't know why you think that Marvel Frozen is an Anglo-Saxon name, but in no world, in no part of that name is a traditional Anglo-Saxon name. But two, even if it is an Anglo-Saxon name, that doesn't mean that she's American. I mean, maybe, but like, you know, the Anglo part of Anglo-Saxon sort of is the clue to it's English, is sort of what you generically think of that as being before necessarily you get to American. So it is just an insane 3 lines of dialogue between these two people, all about one of the most bonkers names in Tomino's whole lineup, that, you know, beat out certainly by Shot Weapon in this show. But Marvel Frozen is near the top of the craziest names, and I fucking love her. I love Marvel. You know, again, this is partially, I have a lot of affection for her from Super Robot Wars because she's one of the pilots in that game as well. but she's just fucking, I don't know, she's just fucking cool. I think Marvel is a totally rad character. And I love her, like, her dynamic with Show and Knee, I think, is very interesting, where there's this sort of like very slight kind of attraction she seemingly has with Knee, but there's obviously this real spark between her and Show that is like there, that like very slowly is developing. There's not like a lot of big scenes between Marvel and Show, but the couple of ones that happen, I think there's like a real chemistry between the two characters, and Knee, you know, we'll talk about him in a second, but I think Knee kind of sucks in a way that works for the show. But as a man, Knee kind of sucks. And her slow kind of like coming around to like seeing that like Show is the person that really I think she is attracted to and has like a much deeper relationship and connection with. And so when you get to episode 19 and those characters meet each other again, and she jumps physically from the cockpit of her battler into the Dunbine's cockpit to embrace Show, is this really like powerful cathartic moment where you have seen these two people kind of a little bit go past each other over the course of the show, but there is this something between them, and that kind of just like blossoms at the end of this arc, and it's really great.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that, and I totally agree. Like, Marvel is a very mature character. Like, there's a real maturity to how she approaches situations and these relationships, and there's a lot of, like, quiet scenes between her and Knee or her and Show where they're just talking, and I really always like those moments. And yeah, as you were saying, the one at the end of episode 19 where they meet up again is just a great moment that makes it feel like we had to end this podcast there.
Yes. Next up, we've got the man with the pink hair, which a little note, the pink hair was inspired by the design of Miki Momo, one of the early magical girl characters. So there's that for you. This is Knee Given, leader of the Zalana, voiced by Ataka Makoto, who has not been in a whole lot of stuff, kind of more of a character actor. But I was looking up his roles, and not a whole lot really jumped out to me. But I think Knee is, when you're talking about the like characters don't pop as much in the show as you sometimes think of in Tomino shows, I think Knee is the biggest example of that, where he's not like a Captain Bright. He's not that like level of charismatic, but I think there's like something that is built into the show, that like he is the leader of this group and he's trying his best, but he's just not. He's not the guy. Like, he's not the guy he really needs to be in order to lead this whole faction of people. And at least, and I don't actually know fully where this character will go, but at least in the stretch of episodes I've seen, like, he still is not quite, like, really taken up this true leadership role the way that Captain Bright does, you know, after the whole arc where Ryu dies in the original Gundam, and he comes back and Bright is like a full-fledged leader that everybody is following. Knee is still not at that point, but I think he's like a very effective character because he kind of sucks, because he's not that good at this stuff, because he's overly emotional. You know, he reminds me a little bit of Katakam from Zabungle, you know, he's really trying super hard to be that guy. He knows who that guy needs to be, but he just can't quite get there yet. And he has these moments of, I think, really like relatable human weakness, like when Show ends up disappearing when he goes into the contemporary world, and you have this brief moment in episode 17 where it cuts back to Byston Well, and Knee is kind of bitter and is suspicious that, like, oh, did he run away? Did he flee? But it's because he can't kind of accept this kind of like growing list of failures he's accumulating. I think there's just something really human and relatable about this guy who's just not the kind of hero character that he needs himself to be.
Yeah, totally, and I think you put that very well. And because he, on paper, would be the more traditional hero of this story, because
yes,
he is the displaced like aristocrat who is the prince of like not a full kingdom, I guess, but of an area of this world. His father is like an important person. He is someone who's out there trying to lead his people against this like horrible oppressor in Drake Luft, and he's not a bad guy. He's not like at no point do you feel like he's in this for the wrong reasons or any of that. Like, he does not have the Katakam thing of kind of having a glory streak in him, I think. But as you say, he's not quite the guy. He's up against impossible odds, and he does not give you the Captain Bright quality of the odds will never be impossible enough. He will pull through, right?
Yeah.
But I think I agree that is what is interesting. It is like this sort of like little family he builds up around him who start allowing them to actually get places with all of this. But I like that. I like that there's no black and white with this character. There's nothing like that is pulling him down that is like necessarily a huge like moral failing or anything, trying his best. But part of it, I think, is he's just stuck in knowing Byston well and like thinking he knows how things work. And like, you see Show and Marvel continually like advise him like, I don't know if this is the right path, because they'll try something and then, you know, Drake will send in Byrne to just blow up the building or something, and they have to reconvene from there.
Yes. But it's a character I'm very interested to see where he goes in the second half, because I don't know from Super Robot Wars. I don't know exactly what happens with them. And then the last main member of our crew is Takeda Yumi playing Keen Kiss, who she is Ayaka, one of the main girls in the Tenchi Muyo series. And then she's also Yoshinaga Midori, which is Shin-chan's teacher in the Cran Shin-chan show, which she did a couple of episodes, you know, just episodes 1 to 680, plus most of the movies. But she retired from that character in 2009, which is why she's only been in 680 episodes of Cran Shin-chan.
Yeah, that's one of those really good gigs. It sounds like she retired for medical reasons. So hope is she still alive?
I believe so.
If you just said retired, I would assume so. But yeah, anyway, it is a very good performance. I really like Keen. I mean, Keen gets a hell of a journey over these episodes because she's someone who is fighting with our heroes here. Her father has a separate sort of, domain, and winds up having to fight, or at least thinks he has to fight for Drake. And that exchange, like in the middle stretch of these episodes, I forget exactly where it is, but where her father dies and she has that whole reaction to it, like that scene where that happens is straight up like out of a Cosmic Glow, where you have like multiple people fighting, and it winds up with this one person dead, and then everyone like reeling after that. It's a great stretch. So like Keen gets truly some of the best character material in these first 19 episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. She's just a very Tomino character,
Yeah.
Like she's like so kind of like this hot shot, flying off the handle, because she has these like, real strong emotional attachments to all these things. I really like Keen a lot.
And the young, also like more of the archetype of the young person who's like learning how to fly the thing and do, because she gets better and better at it over the course of these episodes until like she's a very effective fighter, but at the beginning she doesn't know any of that yet.
Yeah. All right, and then we have our group of bad guys, Drake's faction, as I call him here in the notes, led by Drake Luft himself, voiced by Oki Shoji, very much a character actor kind of voice actor. The big thing that we have covered that he's in is he's Lord Genon, who is the pedophilic aristocrat who has the kind of history with Griffith in that series from the original Berserk anime, Kinpu Denki Berserk, which we covered. And Drake is, again, he is very much the Oda Nobunaga, the Cao Cao from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He is this man of like unquenchable ambition. And, you don't get like huge amounts of deep insight into Drake Luft, at least so far in the series. But I fucking love him and his whole side of the show. I love I think it's just a really good depiction of this kind of character who lives in, in classic Tomino fashion, a bad guy who lives in a den of vipers. Everybody amongst his retinue is trying constantly to stab everyone else in the back to try to get up top, because that's the kind of culture that Drake has kind of created to try to like get the best out of people. He encourages them to kind of destroy each other. And he seems to be fully aware that like Burn Bunnings and Shot Weapon and most of these people are kind of scheming against him. But he's so confident in his own ability to stay on top that he not only does he allow it, it feels like he's secretly kind of encouraging it. And I think it's just like, it's a really well-drawn character for the kind of like low-key appearances he has. Because again, he's not like someone who we get like big monologues from or something. We see him almost always through the eyes of other people looking at him. But it's a very, I think, evocative villain.
And a very good performance. Like, Oki Shoji could definitely play any of those other characters you're talking about, like Nobunaga or Cao Cao. I could have very easily imagined him in, like, a Dynasty Warriors game as this voice. And it just sells the character. And he has to sell the character fast because, as you say, Drake does not have a lot of screen time, but he has to cast a very, very large shadow.
Yes. But someone who does have a lot of screen time is Burn Bunnings, voiced by one of my favorite voice actors, Jaime Sho. Jaime was Maximilian Genius, the Genius. That is both his last name and what he is in Super Dimension Forces Macross, the best pilot on the Macross. That's just a fact. We will also see him in Elgime because he's Gavlet Gable, but not that Gavlet Gable from Zabungle, a totally different character with the identical Crazy Tomino name, who's the main character in Heavy Metal Elgime. He's very well known today as Aizen from Bleach, who's the main villain in the Bleach series. We have talked about him before as Tosaka Tokiyomi, Dean's father in Fate Zero. And then he also plays Vanilla Ice in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders. Not that Vanilla Ice, but a reference to that Vanilla Ice in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders.
I did not know there was a character named Vanilla Ice in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I do now. My life is better. But yeah, Burn Bunnings, 1. Yeah. That is an all-time Tomino name. That is up there with Haran Banjo to me as names I enjoy hearing come off the lips of actors. Like, there's just something about the, like, vowels, the way the sounds go, the consonants, the way it comes out of the mouth. It is fun to say. It is fun to hear people say. It is a great name, and it also sounds like it could be the protagonist of, like, a children's book about a bunny. Burn Bunnings, the bunny who, like, you know, goes and saves the day with his bunny friends on the farm. But no, Burn Bunnings is an evil bastard, and Burn Bunnings, I think, is one of the most compelling characters on this show because he is that kind of extra just despicable villain where he does have a code. He does have some chivalry to him. There's that great scene in one of the later episodes where he sees some of the new recruits being a dick to someone else, or sees his troops being a dick to one of the new recruits, and he really chews the guys out for it. Like, this is not how we do this. And that's not an act. He totally believes that he is following like a code of chivalry while he is, without blinking, executing the most evil, despicable orders from Drake Luft while also planning to overthrow the dude. There's just something about this guy that is like really, really compelling. He is an immediately great Tomino villain. Not as like flamboyant or like, you know, interiorized as someone like Shar Aznable, but in a different vein. I love Burn Bunnings.
Yeah, I feel like he really centers the world of Byston Well incredibly well because he, like, and that whole style of that Sengoku era style drama and the politicking in the betrayals and all of that, where he just fits in that style of narrative so perfectly. And Hayami Sho is just such a good voice actor. Even though this is very early in his career. It's basically the same time that he's playing Max from Macross. And so he doesn't have the full, like, I mean, when you hear him now, his voice is so deep and resonant. It still is at this point, but he's a younger man. But I think it's like he just carries this character so well. And I think Burn is just, one thing that's really fun and interesting about him is he starts off in the section we're covering as like he's kind of the baddest motherfucker around, right? Nobody can kind of match up to him in Aura Battler. But then there's this stretch of episodes where Sho and everyone else on the Zelana are fighting Todd and Goralia over and over again, and Burn is off in kind of his own corner, you know, doing his shit at Drake's side. And then you have this encounter where Burn fights Sho again when all the stuff around Elf Castle happens. And he can't fucking stand up to Sho at all. Like, Sho just fucking knocks him aside, and you see how much Sho has grown as a character, and Burn gets put into this really interesting place at the end of the stretch of episodes we've watched, where he's kind of disgraced. He's failed multiple times, you know, like, the overall agenda of Drake has been pushed forward, but he hasn't been able to actually deliver the goods on defeating Zelana, defeating Sho, like bringing this kind of rebellious faction to a close. And so he's sort of disgraced and removed from his position as the leader of Drake's army. And I think this just puts him in a really interesting place. And there's a real catharsis to seeing Sho just bat this dude aside because he's been on the sidelines too long. He hasn't seen the degree to which this kind of aura power stuff has like really kind of escalated. And he's just been left behind in the dust. And it's a really cool arc for that character so far.
It's one of the things I'm most excited to see with the next set of episodes we're moving into, because now we've got Burn on the back foot, and he has been very much on the front foot, being one of the main movers and shakers of this world so far, but he is not in that position anymore as we leave off in episode 19, so I'm excited to see where he goes next.
Yes, absolutely. All right, a couple of other characters. So we've got Hino Kachiko as Ruza Luft, who's the wife of Drake Luft, and then the daughter, the Princess Rimuru, voiced by Irakawa Kyoko. Obviously, Ruza is not like a huge character, but she is a very striking character to me, and there's that great scene, I think it's episode 7 or 8, where Sho goes to save Rimuru for like the third or fourth time it's happened in the early stretches of the show. and Ruza takes Rimuru hostage and is like threatening to kill her if Show doesn't put Silky back and then flee. And it's like she just is, again, not like a huge amount of screen time for her, but I do think that character just sort of is very striking. And the couple of times she pops up, I think like that sort of like the woman behind the man in power, like it feels like there's more to that character. And I really like her.
That scene is fantastic, and I think one of the dynamics I love here is that obviously, this is actually, I think, a small problem with the episodes we've watched, is that Rimuru is like a really central character for the first 10 episodes or so, and so much of the show is about the, like, jockeying over her, and then she basically disappears for everything else. And I'm sure she will come back, but there is a little bit of, like, I think it's in one of the final episodes of this stretch, you do cut back to Drake Castle and have her in one brief scene, and I was like, oh, right, it's weird that, like, someone who I would have considered one of the, like, 3 or 4 main characters of the show essentially disappears for a while and no one's talking about her, and some of that is a little awkward. But I think one of the reasons it doesn't break the show too hard is that in that middle arc, which you on your notes, Sean, have called the Your Princess is in Another Castle arc, because that is what we are doing, like, Show and the crew eventually get to a point where they very much can rescue Rimuru. Like, they've figured out the way to do this and, like, sneak in and all of that stuff. And what stops them is the utter craven immorality of her parents. Like, there's a level of evil in Drake and Ruza. And you can read it a couple different ways, because maybe it's not evil so much as they understand the weakness of their foes enough that they know as long as they put a gun to their daughter's head, they don't ever have to pull the trigger. These people will flee. But I would still call that evil. Like, there's like a degree of just unbelievable cravenness to these people that they will scar their daughter for life, even if they don't intend to do it or not, what have you. And that will stop everyone in their tracks. And at that point, it kind of doesn't matter what Show and Ni and all of the people on the Zalana can do militarily to go in and get her back, because they're up. It's just like they've invoked the nuclear option. There's nothing they can do. And that is so, and as you say, that scene with Ruza where he has to put the fairy back, Silky. Oh my God, that scene is brutal.
Yes. Yeah, and absolutely, Rimuru, like, the one thing I sort of was waffling a little bit on whether or not we would stop at 19 or go a little bit further is literally the next arc we're going to get into is a Rimuru focus arc that kind of brings that back. But I felt like 19 is, like, such a juicy spot. Let's stop. But yeah, Rimuru, she's definitely, like, a character that has, obviously, like, a lot more to go. But it is, like, very compelling the way in which she is just so purely a political bargaining chip for her parents, and that's why she's, your classic princess locked up in the castle. But yeah, we definitely have a lot more to see with that character later. But let's talk about one of my favorite characters in the show. I just love this guy. It's Todd Guinness, voiced by Osaka Hozumi. Of all the Tomino names, when you have people like Marvel Frozen and Shot Weapon, who are, to be clear, both of them are Americans, it somehow makes it way funnier that you also have Todd Guinness, who is like the most generic white dude fucking name. It's just Todd's running around. And the voice actor here, there's actually a kind of really interesting backstory here. So Osaka Hozumi was only a voice actor for a very short period of time. He did not stick with voice acting, but he has had a wide-ranging career in various other sectors. He was a stage actor. He's a dance choreographer. Apparently, he was also an instructor for a karaoke class. I don't know what that means, but I just saw it, and so I thought I'd put it in the notes. But since Osaka
not a singing teacher, an instructor for a karaoke class, those are somehow different things.
Yes.
I love it.
He was an instructor for a karaoke class. Since Osaka retired from voice acting shortly after Dunbine, the character has been recast as several other actors in different projects, such as there are a couple of compilation movies, but they weren't made by Tomino, so we're not going to cover those. There were like pachinko machines made in the 80s and early 90s. And so there were different voice actors who played Todd in those. But in 1997, for the game Super Robot Wars F, apparently the actor for Show, Nakahara Shigeru, and also the lead actor from Heavy Metal L-Gaim, Hiramatsu Hirokazu, spent half a year looking for Osaka so he could reprise his role for that game. They found him. Osaka decided to reprise the role, and he has continued to play Todd since Super Robot Wars F in all the Super Robot Wars games all the way up to Y, which that tells you there's been a lot of Super Robot Wars games, because he started at F, and the most recent one he was in Y, and they have already made a Z, and I don't know what they're going to do next.
Have they made one for every letter of the alphabet in between those?
It depends on if you count like alpha as A. Most.
Okay.
There have been more Super Robot Wars games than there are letters in the alphabet. Just not all of them are named after alphabet letters.
Fuck. Well, maybe after Z they'll do double Z and go with a Gundam theme, and it'll be the Double Zeta Super Robot Wars game.
Who knows? But either way, our boy Todd, who is to me just like so a precursor to Jared from Zeta Gundam.
I was going to say that. I have that written in my notes right here was what I was going to say. I love that we're on the same page about this, because yes, he is the more affable Jared Mesa.
Yes. Well, because he's somehow like even more of a fuck up than Jared, which somehow puts him into like a slightly different category that makes him even more lovable. But there's just something about like, I mean, even the fact that he's like this weird racist, like, you know, obviously he's an awful person, but you just can't help but love this fucking absolute doofus who just constantly is fucking up. He's this weird racist towards Japanese people. He's calling Show a Jap and shit like that.
That's how he's introduced. Like, talk about, like, abrasive. He's introduced going, hey, Jap, to this guy, which is wild. Yeah.
Yes. But there's just something about this guy that you just can't help but love this fucking idiot. You know, and I think...
Well, here's...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, here's the difference between him and Jared Mesa. Jared Mesa is, like... you know, your Stephen Miller figure or something, like in contemporary politics, just this pathetic piece of shit who all he has to animate him is hatred for others and a feeling of inadequacy, and he makes it everybody else's problem. Todd, I think, genuinely wants to be a hero. He is someone who, genuinely aspires to be something better. And he's never achieved it at any point. And we get a little hint with the character Alan, who comes in, and I'm sure we're going to learn more about that. But, like, clearly he failed on Earth also. And so he takes to Byston Well because this is a chance for him to do something heroic, and he doesn't even get close. Like, in these 19 episodes, he doesn't, like, at least Jared did put up a fight against Camille early on in that show's run. Todd is never a threat. Todd is always, like, it was like a funny, like, counter for me in my notes, how many times Todd goes out and gets his mobile suit completely fucking destroyed by Show and then has to come back with his tail in between his legs, and Byrne is just like, I have no other options. I have to use you. You're my only Upper Earth person here.
Yeah.
I would literally prefer anyone else. Like, as soon as Show hears that they're calling in new Upper Earthers, he has to run away and try to fight Show because he knows he has no job once there are other people to do it. He is so bad at it. But then the episode where he quote unquote dies, he's seemingly something else is going on because there's a mysterious character who takes his body. So whether or not he's ultimately dead, we don't know yet. But, like, that's the end of his arc, at least for now. And it's genuinely a little tragic because even at his maximum effort, Show wipes the absolute fucking floor with him. And you do feel a little bad for this guy because what he wants is so far out of his reach. At least Jared could be a good fascist. Todd can't even be that.
Yeah, but I think that's a great breakdown. And, you know, obviously, like, one of the main things they both, Todd and Jared, have in common, beyond them being both blonde white dudes that have very generic American guy names, Jared and Todd, amongst people named Camille and Quattro Bagina and Recco Alonde and Shot Weapon and Marvel Frozen and all these people. It's like, and then here's Jared and here's Todd. But they are both men who think they are the main characters of the story. But they very much are not, but in slightly different ways. But I feel comfortable just going ahead and confirming that Todd will return in Avengers Doomsday or Battle Dunbine Part 2.
Sean, you know, people have been making their fake parody trailers of X will return in Avengers Doomsday. Can you imagine if we made one of those for Todd Guinness? It would be the lowest rated viral video of all time, a viral video attempt, because like 3 people would get the joke.
Yes, but, you know, because, you know, that the scene where he's like seemingly killed, but obviously is not, is so fantastic, where his fucking cockpit doors get like jammed open and he fucking falls out of it. It's like unbelievable to me that this is the only time I could think think about the top of my head this has happened where someone just straight up falls out of a cockpit in these shows, because it seems like it should happen all the time. But it
happens a lot in Zabungle, although it's a different kind of context there. Yeah.
Yeah, there they get like thrown from it like it's a fucking car crash. But here it's like they're flying in the sky and he just topples. But he does hit a tree. There's a mysterious Garrodon lady at the bottom. And we will see Todd come back. I can say that, which I'm very excited.
I want to see more of Todd. Todd Guinness, one of the all-time great non-American comes up with the name for an American person. Let's pick generic white boy name and the name of that beer brand everyone likes.
Yes. Oh, fucking Todd. He's so good. And an equally great character, but in different ways, is the next one. Garalia Nyamhi, I assume is how you're supposed to say her last name, played by Saijo Miki, who, very similar to Todd, Saijo Miki retired from voice acting fairly early. This is the only role I can find credited for her. I'm sure she probably did other stuff, but it's probably more obscure. And so this character, if you see her in other appearances, that character has been recast. And unlike Super Robot Wars, I don't know, maybe they did go on like a great quest to go find her and they couldn't, or maybe she didn't want to do it. I don't know. But either way, I do think I think it's a fucking great performance. It's a great character. And Garalia is the character I think that almost more than anybody ties this arc of episodes of 1 to 19 that we have picked, because it is like the life and times of Garalia. Her death is kind of the thing that signals the ending of this stretch of the show. Where she is someone else kind of like Todd, someone who is desperate to get ahead in the world, desperate to be some kind of hero, is possessed of tremendous ambition, but one does not have the sort of like, the goods to fully back it up. And two, I do think there's also an element of her being a woman in this world that exacerbates this inability for her to kind of like really be the person on top like she thinks she should, and unfortunately she dies never being able to get here. And I can also confirm that Garalia will not return Adventures Doomsday because she's dead as fuck.
Garalia might be my favorite character of the show so far.
Yeah.
And part of that is that obviously she has had a full, complete arc, so I can judge her differently than I can other characters on the show. But like, I mean, the thing with the difference with Todd though is that she is talented. She is good at what she does. And because it's both that she is a woman and she is from Byston Well. So she is at a disadvantage in the Aura Battler stuff because of the like lore of all of this versus the Earth Fighters. And she does put up a good fight against Show. She makes a lot of trouble for the Zalana. And in that arc on Earth, like the abjection of her being the person, like, it's Show's story in reverse, because now she is the person getting isekai'd. And the way she just freaks out, she goes on a mass, historical killing spree we'll talk about, but then is like such a like pitiable character by the end. Even Show, it's just like, I love the scene, episode 18, probably my favorite of the show so far. And the way that one ends with him like begging her, like, look, you and I can duke it out as much as you want back in Byston Well, but let's do it there. You don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. I fucking hate this place. You fucking hate this place. Let's combine our aura powers. He finally gets through to her, and that is when she ultimately flames out. It's like she burns too bright and then is poof, gone. And then Show is left alone in Upper Earth. That's resolved pretty quickly in the next episode. But at that moment, oh my God, that was like the height of my love of this show so far, is all of that stuff.
Yeah, and just the tragedy of this woman who, again, like pushed herself so far to try to be on top. And you get these brief flashes of kind of her history where clearly, she's from this like very kind of tragic, kind of impoverished background and has worked so hard to be in the position she is. There's a whole dynamic where she also starts sleeping with Zeto Light, who is Shot Weapon's right-hand guy, in order to get, presumably in order to get access to these better Aura Battlers that she ends up piloting. And so she's kind of done everything she possibly can to get ahead. And at the end, as I say, it can't possibly be enough because she just doesn't have enough aura power because she's from Byston Well or whatever. When she tries to resonate with Show and open the Aura Road once again, it's too much. It overloads her machine and she just explodes. And she dies alone in an alien world, basically. And most people back in where she's from don't really know that. They don't know what has happened to her, and will never really know because because she's just gone. And it's like this really like potent tragedy for this character that, you know, starts out fairly despicable because she is this very abrasive character. You know, like I think she's kind of supposed to get on your nerves a little bit early on because she's so ambitious. She's so kind of like cutting and trying to like get ahead at every single turn and keeps failing. And she's not kind of comedic in the way she does that like Todd, which makes Todd, it's a little bit more funny. He's a bit more bumbling. Like she's so earnest about it, and keeps on failing. But it's like at a certain point, she just becomes such an empathetic person. Even when she has ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people in her kind of madness, you can't help but feel bad for this person who just can't get the things that she needs in her life and just dies this really tragic death alone in another place where nobody will ever be able to visit her grave, you know?
I mean, it is like the show's so far ultimate statement on the way men, you know, leaders, fascists like Drake Luft burn through people. Like
Yes.
they literally inspire them to, you know, go full tilt towards this certain vision of power and empowerment. And most people are not built for that because people are not built for that. It is an inhuman thing to try to become. And she ultimately just literally, her life just extinguishes in that pursuit. And it is a very powerful thing to be the final narrative movement that sends us back into the Byston Well story. Like, very, very powerful.
Yeah. And it's also the fact that, you know, she's fighting there at that point for a thing that's so meaningless. You know, this like notion of I will defeat you show because, you know, you are our enemy, you're the enemy of Drake Luft. It's like nobody would even know if you beat him, and if you did, how would you ever get back? Like, how would it ever matter, right? And it's like eventually that gets through to her, but it like sort of highlights the pointlessness of her role in this whole affair in Drake's army, is that she's just one of dozens and dozens of these kinds of people he's got. And he's summoning more from Upper Earth as well. And it's just like the meaninglessness of it all. It's very tragic.
Yeah.
Next up, we've got the best name maybe in all of Tomino-Dumb. We've already been talking about it. Shot Weapon, Tanaka Masahiko, our favorite Californian, the man who somehow is some sort of mad genius who can combine our technology with the power of the Aura. He is Makave, the recast of Makave in the Gundam movie trilogy, because there are a couple of characters that have different voices in that. He's also Gowron, the main bad guy in Full Metal Panic. Super different kind of character than that, and also very different character, Dot Pixis, in Shingeki no Kyojin or Attack on Titan. But Shot, we haven't had like all that much with him, but he's clearly this schemy little motherfucker. Like you get these couple of little moments where we know, for instance, he's sleeping with the character Musi Po, and we know that he's got some kind of plan, that he is like one of these other like, you know, misogynist bad guys. And you get, I think, for me, I get some like Pap Miss Shiroko vibes from him, where it's like he's not yet full center, and I think he will be eventually. I'm not sure. But like it feels like he's eventually going to come more to the forefront because he's got some kinds of schemes going on. He is another kind of misogynistic manipulator, using his status to try to get people to do what he wants while he's trying to work in the background to potentially supplant Drake. I don't know what the whole full deal is. Again, Super Robot Wars doesn't go into that kind of detail with the main plot, so I don't know. But I'm very interested in seeing where this character is going to go.
Absolutely. Me too. I think someone will talk about more next time. But like the entire idea in the lore of the series of I mean, we haven't talked about enough, maybe we'll transition to the genre conversation here in a second and talk about it, but the just sheer surreality of watching all this mecha action happening in this high fantasy environment never stops being crazy to me and like really being striking. And the lore explanation for that of this character from our contemporary Earth falling into Byston Well and becoming this genius inventor is such a killer idea for the story that Shot Weapon as a character like casts this very large shadow, even when so far it's hard to even call him a character in terms of how much we've seen him. We don't know him yet, but the idea is just phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's more like voice actors I just want to shout out really quickly. It's not a big character, but it's the guy that Gralia is sleeping with. Zeto Light is voiced by Tachiki Fumihiko, who's Ikari Gendo, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, one of the biggest voice actors. This is one of his absolute earliest roles, particularly as a named character. He is a very minor one-off character in a single episode of Zabungle, But this is, if you're looking at his filmography, this is like one of the most notable roles in his early career. And obviously he will be a much, much bigger voice actor later on. But I thought it was cool. And I did not recognize his voice. And it was only when I was looking it up, I'm like, oh my God, that's Gendo, everybody. I mean, we just talked about him with our KyoAni season because he's the evil dad in the most recent Kobayashi made Dragon movie. And so it's cool to see one of his earliest roles. Another voice actor I want to shout out for a character that will be much more prominent in the second half is Musi Po, who's voiced by Yoko Mari, who is Elchi Cargo from Combat Mecha Zabungle. Again, she's just kind of in it a little bit so far, but even in just the few episodes I've watched past 19, she becomes like a much more notable character, kind of like the new Goralia in some ways, of like another Aura Battler to fight the main characters. And then another super early performance of an incredibly notable actor, and doing two roles here. We have Wakamoto Norio, Cell from Dragon Ball himself, is playing Alan Brady, but then also, more importantly, and one that it took me forever to catch on to, because he's so young here, is he is the narrator of the show, doing the whole spiel about the land between the sea and the shore and all of that. But this is one of his absolute earliest roles. Like, his first really big role is he plays the villain in Dankuga, a Super Robot show. That's 2 years after this. This is 5 years before he plays the coach character in Gunbuster. This is like one of his earliest notable roles. And I couldn't believe that I wasn't able to immediately catch that he plays the narrator, because his voice is so distinctive. And once you know it, you can hear it. But it's not the kind of performance you expect from a Wakamoto Norio, who's very larger than life, and this very kind of restrained, subtle, almost kind of melodic narrative voice he has, which works perfectly for the show. It's like a really pleasant surprise that that's who it is doing it.
So I didn't realize he was the narrator until now, looking at your notes.
Wow, yeah.
I did clock him as Alan as soon as Alan opened his mouth, because then he's doing his rolled R's, he's doing the Wakamoto Norio thing, and it took me a second because he is younger, but I wrote in my notes, that has to be Wakamoto Norio, right? And I didn't even really bother to look it up because it was so clearly him. But then the narrator, I hadn't clocked that, but you're right. I mean, there is an extra layer of relevance to that opening for us now, because there is this alien familiarity to the voice, where it's a voice you think you know, but it's in a form you can't really place. But as the narrator, he is tremendous. And, the narrator position in anime is always a tough but such a crucial role to play. And I love when you hear an actor you know from other things doing this, which is just a totally different kind of assignment than Cell or Coach or any of those characters. Yeah. And yes, it is fantastic narration.
Absolutely. I think that's what I've got for them. There are obviously other characters and other voice actors, but a lot of them are also people that are more important in the second half. Then we can talk about, I think, Show's parents when we get to that stretch. But do you want to just talk about the genre-ness of this show and kind of get into that?
Yeah, I think we can talk about the genre thing, and then I think we've talked about a lot of the narrative movements, but we particularly want to talk about the last stretch of these episodes, I think, for today's episode. But yeah, let's talk about genre, because this is fascinating.
Yeah, so I kind of went down a little bit of a research rabbit hole to kind of try to put into context some of the fantasy thing here. So I've kind of written up a piece of the notes. So I'm just going to kind of read through this, and then we can talk about how what stands out about the genre elements here. So one remarkable element of Aura Battler Dunbine that's worthy of a lot of discussion is its genre construction. It's easy to take for granted the isekai tropes in the plot if you don't put the show in its proper context. In fact, it's very hard to find a TV show that's more on, again, I call this a genre island compared to its peers than Aura Battler Dunbine. Before we look at that piece, though, how kind of unique it is in that specific way, let's briefly place it in the context in the fantasy genre, because I think it makes it more clear kind of why it's so different and why the fantasy feels, I think, different than what you normally expect. So, for the purposes of this, I'm going to set aside right now, just put aside the fact that it's a mecha show and a fantasy show at the same time, and ignore the genre fusion thing, and let's just think about the fantasy piece. And I want to specifically zoom in on just those elements. To do this, there are two major traditions we need to kind of track, because there are two different kinds of fantasy this falls into. One is what I'm going to call medieval fantasy. It's more traditionally called high fantasy, but I don't like that term. And then we have portal fantasy is the other piece. The medieval fantasy, or fantasy that models its setting on medieval Europe, think Lord of the Rings, comes broadly out of the Arthurian tradition. So the stories around King Arthur and similar things like the Charlemagne stories from France and his paladins. those kind of ancient chivalric stories from the medieval period see a massive resurgence in the Victorian period as part of that Romanticism movement that also is part of that Celtic revival thing we talked about earlier. So in the Victorian period, there's this big renewal and interest in knights, dragons, wizards, fairies, those sorts of things. And that then fuels part of this huge boom in fiction. That's the pulp fiction movement of the pulp fiction magazines of the early 20th century, that you have all these big horror stories, you get the big detective stories, you get big science fiction stories, but you also have a big explosion in fantasy style stories with, I would say, the defining work of that period being Robert Howard's Conan the Barbarian stories are probably like the most memorable and kind of most successful of those. But there's this huge explosion in fantasy literature in the early 20th century. Moving forward, that then leads us into the next, and I would say arguably most profoundly defining work of the genre, which is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings in 1954, which kind of moves that genre into a different kind of sphere overall. And the popularity of The Lord of the Rings sparks a much broader tradition of fantasy literature, which explodes throughout the 60s and 70s. And that's what you think of when books like Earthsea, the Sword of Shannara, right? Like, you get that whole tradition kind of coming out of Lord of the Rings. This literary and artistic tradition was then transformed into a new medium in the 70s with the advent of tabletop RPGs with Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. That then in turn inspires those games to be translated into the digital realm with early PC RPG games on the Apple II like Wizardry and Ultima, which both came out in 1981. So in America, when we're looking at this time period, the late 70s, early 80s, had this big resurgence and evolution of this genre. And a lot of what we think of as fantasy really gets codified in that specific period, especially with like the Dungeons and Dragons elements. That evolution would make its way to Japan eventually in 1985, when Wizardry was released there, and then the release of Wizardry in Japan inspires the creation of Dragon Quest, and Dragon Quest inspires all the rest, and that is, as we say, is history, because Dragon Quest is like the ur-text of the Japanese, European medieval fantasy, or whatever the fuck weird name you want to give to this very like cultural lens genre of Western fantasy in Japanese media. But for Dunbine itself, remember, Dunbine was released in 1983. So that whole shift in the fantasy genre that we're talking about with like Dungeons and Dragons, all that kind of stuff, that had not yet made its way to Japan. And so Dunbine, in my reading of where I think the influences are, much more comes from this early 1900s, late 1800s kind of Victorian period. In fact, if you read the Byston Well novel Tomino published, The Wings of Reen, I think it's even more obvious that there are some of those pulp fantasy elements that are there in the inspiration, a la Conan the Barbarian. The much more overt sex and violence in Wings of Reen very much feels like it comes from that kind of Conan the Barbarian tradition. There's very explicit depictions of group sexual assault right in kind of the first scene. The main character Sakamizu gets summoned in the midst of this kind of post-battle where all the fairies and these women are being assaulted by this like group of warriors, and he has to fight them. And in fact, there's this one very kind of strange moment where Tomino describes the fact that an assailant who's attacking Sakamizu's penis is still erect from this whole thing when Sakamizu has to defend himself. Like, it's very sexually explicit, and that feels like it comes out of that kind of pulp fiction influence. Whether or not Tomino read the Conan the Barbarian stories, I don't know, but like there's some sort of like cultural osmosis at least that's happening there. For additional context, just to like make it clear, there were some of these fantasy books had been translated to Japanese by this point. So Lord of the Rings was translated to Japanese in 1972 to 1975, while D&D, though, it had not come out in Japan until 1985, so D&D could not have been an influence directly. Most major literary works in the fantasy genre from the 60s and 70s in English, if they were translated, took about 10 years to be translated and published in Japanese. So things like Earthsea came out 10 years after it did in English in 1968. So there were some of these novels that existed in Japanese prior to Dunbine's development, but they would have been very niche and very rare at that point. So if he had read any of those books, I don't know, but I don't think you can see their influence very directly. So that's the medieval fantasy tradition, again, coming out of that kind of Victorian sector. The other piece, though, is that you have the portal fantasy genre, or what we would now call isekai. This was historically called the portal fantasy. So isekai is a massive genre now, so much so that we just call it by isekai even in English. And Dunbine is a formative work within that bigger genre, but it is important to understand that this framing of a contemporary person wandering into a fantasy world, that is as old as fantasy stories. So I don't want to like people to think that isekai is like a new thing, or this is like inventing some sort of genre. It's a super common framing, generally speaking, within folklore and fairy tales in all sorts of cultures. It starts to become more formalized in what we call the portal fantasy stories in that kind of genre in the late 19th, early 20th century with works like Alice in Wonderland, Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Peter Pan, The Wizard of Oz, The Lion, the Witch, of Wardrobe, etc. Right? So it's a pretty popular form in the late Victorian through to the 1950s. The element that is more distinctive to Dunbine and more formative to what I would say is like specifically what we think of as isekai is the specific notion that this main character did not somehow wander into the fantasy world, but was deliberately summoned through the use of magic to achieve a specific purpose. And that forms the basis of one of two types of isekai in anime. You have the Tenni, the summon stories, which Dunbine is a part of, but you also have the Tensei, the reincarnation stories, which is, I think, a little bit more common these days, where like a dude gets run over by a truck, dies, and is reincarnated in another world. That's a little bit of a different framing. But this specific, like you are summoned by like a wizard or something, and then you have to go accomplish a mission, that's a really specific framing that is really similar to how it's used past this point. So if Dunbine has like a really particular influence, I suspect that it is that framing of these kind of isekai stories. Because I am not specifically familiar with, there may well be one, but I don't know of another story that has that exact framing before Aura Battler Dunbine. Certainly not in like anime. Maybe there's a book. But
well, like in Japanese folklore, this distinction also exists, and like that those terms come from like analyzing folklore more than anime, obviously. And so you have stuff like Urashima Taro, where he's like taken on the back of the turtle to the other world. But so there is a distinctly like Japanese version of this, but yeah, within like bringing it into like this kind of contemporary fantasy context, that's where this feels like really innovative in a way that, you know, today isekai largely for anime means stories in literal video games or video game-esque worlds, and that's in part because of the influence of Dragon Quest, because that's where you can have stuff like Konosuba, where not technically a video game, but it's a video game because they're in Dragon Quest. They can't say they're in Dragon Quest, but we all know they're in Dragon Quest, right? Exactly. And so it's that kind of thing. Or the fact that you have, you know, shows that are just about like, you know, I got reincarnated as a slime or something like that, right? So yeah, it is, as you were saying, like it is that blend of elements where it's really hard to pinpoint where this is, because it is divorced from a lot of the immediate things we would grab onto trying to describe it as a similarity to.
Yeah, it you know, it doesn't have dwarves and elves, you know, it doesn't have magic, it's got aura. It's like it is not leaning on the common series of references you use in this kind of fantasy, because that kind of fantasy was not in Japan at the time. Now, and so I want to lay out, because I went through a list of kind of just like trying to find anything of like just to highlight how fucking ahead of its time the show is in terms of, or the nice way to look at it is ahead of its time, or how dumb of an idea it was, because there's no precedent for success, right? There's like nothing that showed that this popular would be successful at this time, because there's nothing like it. So let's look at what the landscape for this kind of medieval fantasy style anime was in 1983, which is just basically completely barren. So there were adaptations of fairy tales. You know, those are fairly common. Those are broadly in that kind of world masterpiece theater wheelhouse of adapting classic Victorian literature. And you've got lots of like little animal, you know, Rascal the raccoon and shit like that. But anime which depicted things like knights, dragons, wizards, that kind of magic, that was basically non-existent. In fact, I think one thing that's interesting is that Tomino's adaptation of Triton of the Sea is one of the closest shows you get in that style in the 1970s, but it's much more Jason the Argonaut's like Sword and Sandals, which is a slightly different kind of fantasy from Greek mythology than this. But it is like, it's one of the closest that you can find. There's also the 1979 TV series Intake no Kishimonogatari, Moedo Arthur, or the Story of the Knights of the Round Table, Burn Arthur, which sounds way worse in English. The Moedo Arthur sounds like a more positive connotation than Burn Arthur. Sounds like you're killing him. So there was that TV show, which was King Arthur stuff. There's a 1980 movie called Sirius no Densetsu, which was released over here as The Sea Prince and the Fire Child in English, which is close-ish, but is also more fairy tale coded than it is like this sort of medieval fantasy style. So suffice to say, the genre was effectively non-existent. So Dunbine was an incredible anomaly, covered up in part by its genre blend of being fantasy and mecha, which is, I think, the thing it uses to kind of wedge its way into existence, is it's that it's still attached to a more familiar genre through that. But even after the release of Dunbine, it takes years until the genre becomes more commonplace. So you do have some things. You've got like Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind in 1984, and obviously the manga is in 1982, which is fantasy, but still not this kind of fantasy. There are a handful of small projects like OVAs and movies in the mid-'80s, almost all of which, like the OVA Ganmu Senki Leda, are summoned-style isekai stories. So you do have, if they do this, it is a summon-style isekai story. You have basically no just straight-up, this is like a Dragon Quest style, I'm a hero in another world, and it's just that's a character that lives in that world. This doesn't start to break until you get all the way to the end of the 80s with the 1-2 punch of the Dragon Quest animes, most famously Dragon Quest Dino Daiboken, and then you have Record of Lodoss War, the OVA, which is itself an adaptation of a novel series that is a proper fantasy because all it is the author retelling their D&D campaign like proper fantasy literature should be. If you're writing a fantasy book and it's not you having done a D&D campaign that you're just turning into a book, you're not writing real fantasy. However, fantasy anime would not actually become a popular, ubiquitous genre, the kind of thing we think of now. Because even those, like Dino Daiboken, Record of Lodoss War, you're talking about 1 or 2 shows every couple of years. It's not until the mid-1990s where you get works like Slayers, released in 1995, that really kind of define and codify the genre as this industry standard, something that you can expect there to be at least one fantasy-style show every anime season, which continues through to this day. And obviously, what kind of fantasy you're talking about changes over the years, but it's around 1995 is every year there's 1, 2, or 3 of them. And then nowadays there's 1, 2, or 3 of them every anime season, let alone a year there's like dozens. And so it is not until over a decade after Dunbine comes out that I would say this kind of broad fantasy genre it's a part of becomes commonplace. And that just shows you how wildly ahead of its time, like way out there, Aura Battler Dunbine is. And it's fucking crazy. Like if you just go to any website that has lists of all the Japanese TV shows released that year, and you just scroll, it's fucking nothing, and it's crazy.
Yeah, I really don't know of a comparable example of this kind of thing where it is such a genre outlier in its proper, like, historical context. But it's part of what makes the show so hard to wrap your head around in such a, I find, invigorating way of just the imagery of these mechas, I think of them as mobile suits because obviously my touch point is Gundam, but the Aura Battlers, whatever you want to call them, flying over castles, and you have scenes of characters like loading ballista to fire at the fucking mechs, and it's like, this is crazy. Like, more context for this would be like, I could see like Hidetaki Miyazaki today doing something like this, and like blending those two things together, but even there's very few touch points for what this is doing. Like, one of the other things I think Tomino does that emphasizes this is I don't think there's any other Tomino show that gives you as visceral a sense of aerial action as Dunbine. Because there's no outer space, obviously. This is all happening but in Byston Well or on Earth itself. And so he's done other shows that have a lot of Earth stuff. And obviously Zabungle was all on an un-Earth-like planet, although it didn't have any flight, really, until near the end. But this, everybody's flying, and one thing you'll notice is Tomino frames a lot of shots. Usually we're below the mech looking up, and in the outer space shows that makes total sense. He often frames it the other way so that the ground is beneath us, and when you have the ground beneath you, it means that you get a sense of speed much more viscerally because you have a reference point for how fast the thing is moving, and you also have that sort of sense of vertigo of the distance between the mech and the earth below it. And so there's this real like out-of-body experience to watching this. And because it is in this high fantasy setting, this medieval setting, where you have Tomino-style mech action as good as it's ever been, but with that extra component of feeling so embodied in that environment, like, sometimes I have to, like, I feel like I need a Dramamine or something watching this show. Like, it's really visceral. It gives you a little bit of vertigo. It's really a lived-in thing, and it blows my mind.
Yeah, and it is that because it is not leaning on common reference points, all of it feels very unique unto itself. Or
Yeah.
like the reference points it's pulling from are like just way more obscure. You know, it's pulling from this more classical version of the genre from the late 1800s, early 1900s, not D&D and Dragon Quest and Lord of the Rings. Like, it's not going to that wheelhouse. And it's just something that makes it really invigorating. And I think it's one of the things that makes the mecha thing work as well as it does. I think it would actually be like, I don't think it wouldn't land as well if it was dwarves were making the mechs and they were fighting elves in the forest and stuff like that. The fact that it's Mi Ferrario and the A Ferrario and the Garodan, the like weird like guys who can run really fast, who are part of like the earth. You know, this like really unique version of a setting that is totally invented by Tomino, with the kind of like mythological precedence, helps make this sort of weird blend or genre fusion he's doing work really well, because it's not trying to butt heads with like a really well-defined set of genres. It is existing in its own space, I think, very successfully. And you do just get these kind of bonkers moments where, like, when they're trying to take Elf Castle for the first time, Drake's forces, and they get kind of fought off, and Burn Bunnings is like, you know what? It maybe doesn't work great for us to go flying in with our Aura Battlers and also send the cavalry and like a contingent of infantry dudes with swords, because they kind of just get blown the fuck up in like this aerial raid. And it's like the insanity of seeing ballistas firing at giant flying bug machines and like them dropping bombs on people and shit like that. It's just really crazy and kind of in this really cool, surreal way, but it's so cool, and it's just like really is so unique and singular to Dunbine. You know, as someone who's watched a lot of fantasy anime, man, there ain't nothing like this shit. Like, this shit hits in a totally different way than anything else I've ever seen.
Agreed, and I think the other genre it is worth bringing up here that it just feels like it is used in a very different way than any other mecha show I've seen is because you get back to Upper Earth. And Upper Earth is just our Earth. It is contemporary modern-day Japan, which Tomino has not really done before, which the mecha genre doesn't ever really do in this way. He chooses to frame all of that stuff very, very differently than any other mecha show he's ever done. And I feel like his specific reference point is kaiju movies. Like, he specifically frames like, for one, you have all of the military stuff. And when the military is coming in, I'm just hearing the Godzilla theme in my head as, you know, the Japanese National Defense Force assembles to fight Godzilla. So you've got all of that. And I think that's a very clear reference point. But also the fact that once you get there, he starts doing stuff with the mech that Tomino really never does. Like framing from the ground as we look up and see it flying overhead, or having people in a skyscraper looking out as it flies past and blows something up. All of those kind of ground level shots to make you feel the insanity, the weirdness of having this larger than life thing invade your world, which of course is the goal of a Godzilla movie or anything like that, is to put you in the grounds of, this is why Godzilla movies are almost always contemporary, is to make you feel like he's coming into your world today. It's like Godzilla -1 being a period piece is like an outlier, right?
Yeah.
And you have the today's military is trying to fight Godzilla, and you get all of that here. And so if the fantasy stuff defamiliarizes mecha action in one direction, when you get back to Upper Earth, it equally, I think, defamiliarizes your sense of like what mecha action is in a different direction, and that clash is so powerful to me.
Oh, absolutely, because it's like it's kind of one of the master strokes of this, and it feels like, that to me feels like it's the whole thing that Tomino is trying to do. Like, that to me feels like it's the kernel of the idea at the heart of this, because the conceptualization of Byston Well isn't that it's just a fantasy world. It is like this other spiritual world. It is something that is tied into the cycle of reincarnation. It's a reflection or a mirror of the world in which we live. And so there's something fundamental about this sense of like this primal spiritual existence that is being invaded and corrupted and kind of destroyed by this modern technology and the world in modernization, right? I think it's very notable that Wings of Rain, the main character, is a World War II pilot, right? Who's being brought into that world. I think like that World War II, you know, kind of like how it is for Gundam and obviously huge amounts of Japanese media made by people who grew up or lived through that period of the 1940s. Like World War II is this sort of like central element in this sort of the scale of the destruction, the mechanization of the world is corrupting this fundamental part, this place where the soul goes to rest, this other world. And so when that happens, this monstrous version of it is created, these big beetle creatures that when they break back into our world, they are monsters, they are kaiju, they're things that they're, you know, are able, their weapons, instead of like in Byston Well, do little like regular kinds of damage that like a jet plane could do. In our world, it's like the equivalent of a fucking nuclear bomb, basically. And you're talking about people dying in the tens to the hundreds of thousands. And so I think there is something where it feels so potently to me that the whole point of the fantasy thing, right, that Tomino made a note to himself that I'm not trying to just make a fantasy show. That's not like what he's doing. Is to explore from a different angle the kinds of themes he's always been interested in, which is the kind of like the cost of mechanization, the cost of war on the human soul, and all these kinds of things that before he was exploring through more the lens of the new types in the sci-fi setting. Here it's through aura power, Byston Well, the cycle of reincarnation, this fantasy lens. And it just gives you a totally different perspective on it, which is really, really exciting.
Yeah. And to just head one comment I think I'm going to get from my last comment off at the pass here, so I don't have to read it on YouTube. Yes, like Neon Genesis Evangelion would be the example of doing the kaiju stuff with the mecha genre, because that's its entire premise, is depicting mecha action through the lens of kaiju movies and TV shows like Ultraman. But it's over a decade later. That's my point, is that this is and certainly Tomino doesn't ever really do it that way. And so there is something about seeing it in this moment in time and seeing how it's doing that, that is like really visceral.
Yeah, and a lot of other things that it does is like the way it defamiliarizes you with all the fantasy elements. I mean, we talked about that a little bit with like when Show goes back to Byston Well, it feels like an actual homecoming, that we're coming back to this world we're familiar with. One of my favorite things that this whole transition between Byston Well and the real world does is your relationship with Cham. That when Cham comes with him, Show, and then you have the first encounter between Show and his parents, and they like don't recognize Show. They think he's some sort of monster. And then Cham comes flying out, and everybody flips the fuck out. And it's a fantastic moment because you've been living with this adorable little fairy girl for 15 episodes of the TV show. But there was this like visceral, like, oh, right. Like I like pictured, it made me picture in my mind's eye, like, what if there was a little 6-inch tall human with wings that flew into this room I'm in? Like, that is a horrifying idea. Like, that is like, when you like think about like the actual lived experience of that happening in the real world, is like skin crawlingly disgusting to me in a way I had never thought about in the context of fairies. It like helped me actually think a little bit of, I think, why the Victorians loved the fairy thing. Because again, one axis of the Victorian obsession with fairies was one that was very horror tinged. And there's like these little horrible little imp creatures. They're not always little beautiful fairies that get born out of flowers. Sometimes these mischievous gremlin kind of things. And it's like, yeah, like that is a fucked up idea. Like that would be so scary and kind of like defamiliarize your idea of what like a human being is in this very visceral way. And I think that the way that Tomino like plays and paces out all these reveals as Show comes into the real world and all these Byston Wellian elements get exposed to contemporary 1980s Japan, it's just really effective at making you re-question and re-examine all the assumptions you make about this kind of fantasy adventure you've been on up till then.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, where do we want to go next? Do we want to just dig?
Do you want to do the Celtic mythology thing, or do you want to save that for next time?
Let's save that for next time, because I think we're here talking about that last arc. Let's just like get full in on it, because I think that's where we're at. One thing I want to note about this last arc and just the structure of the show in general is the show, a lot like Zabungle, is really disciplined in its structure, where it has very clear 4-episode arcs. Episodes 1 through 4 mark a very clear arc of Show starting with Drake, and then he ends with me. Episodes 5 through 8 strike a very clear arc where it starts with Show and crew trying to find out how to rescue Dimadu, and it ends with them ultimately realizing that they can't. Part 3, the one I called in my notes, The Battlers Who Say Me, because I want to say the point that I made the Knights of Me joke first, is episodes 9 through 12.
We're all thinking it as we're watching the show. I mean, it's kind of impossible with the setting and the name. It's perfect.
Yeah, that arc is all about them going to the Kingdom of Me and trying to help out the Kingdom of Mi, who's being attacked by Drake Luft and Drake's forces, and that arc ends with them going to this other kingdom where Ella and Pat Hood are originally from, the kind of queen and daughter of the Kingdom of Mi. And that kind of ends that part. And then you have part 4, what I call Bye Bye Byston Well, episodes 13 to 16, which is this kind of series of episodes about the Zalana and Show being with King Foizon Ro in this other kingdom and kind of trying to build up their forces. And then them going to trying to deal with all the stuff of Elf Castle. And so Drake finally deciding to just overthrow the king who supposedly is ruling him, because Drake now has enough power to say, I'm just going to do a full-on coup and become the top man in my country. And in the midst of that, it's like halfway through episode 16, which would be the last episode of that arc, is when all of a sudden Show and Garalia clash. The aura power explodes, the aura road opens up, and they are swept into Tokyo for the title of the episode, Skies Over Tokyo. And so it is this really masterful piece of pacing, I think, where you're really comfortable with this 4 episode chunks. At the end of that 4 episodes, you get like a pretty nice note that sort of wraps up what that chunk of episodes was about. And at the end of this chunk, that last episode, instead of being a nice little, and even if it's a sad conclusion, like Elf Castle falls and we failed, it still is a conclusion. And instead, it's like all of a sudden you're like ripped out of it and you're thrown into this whole different context and your mind is just like twisted. And I think the way that it's structured and the shape of the show is so fucking perfect and so kind of just like beautiful in the simplicity of how that's executed. It's like how just the sheer like meta pacing of the show is designed to make this a real harsh interruption of the thing that you expect, to just heighten everything that this arc is doing.
I mean, it literally comes at the moment you expect the climax of that 4th arc,
yes.
Whatever that will be. Whether he defeats Garalia and then kicks Burn Bunning's ass and they save the castle, or they lose the castle, which they did in the previous arc, right? And so maybe they have to move on. What have you. We are at, if you were to do the little like diagram of like the audience interest in the story over the structure, You're at the highest point. And at the highest point, and also Show and Garalia are at their highest points, right? Because they're really fighting to the death in this moment. Suddenly we are on Earth. Yeah. And like, I, for one, at least, Sean, I hadn't spoiled myself on any of this. I hadn't even really thought of that as a possibility yet. I was assumed at some point, and in the traditional structure of a portal fantasy, or even most modern isekai, I would think late in the story, either the end or near the end. Tomino clearly thought that, because as we learned from your notes, that was his original plan, was this would happen later on. But it happens at this point. And so at this point where you are at the highest level of like excitation in the story, now you have something totally different to deal with. And then it is that dawning realization of, right, this isn't just Earth. This is contemporary Earth. This is Show. This is his parents. This is his world. And it is just this violent being ripped out of this one story you thought you were watching. It's a different story. And then I think what is so wild is in that portal fantasy way, it is really this stretch of episodes that are treated more like a traditional portal fantasy than anything in Byston Well. Because this is where the weird stuff happens. This is where the massive death and destruction happens. This is where the main character is like really challenged on who they are and what they stand for and what they want. And it happens here where we go back to our world for this brief interregnum before we go back to Byston Well. And I know you did the same thing, Sean. I gobbled through these episodes way faster than I intended. I just could not stop, basically, until he was back, and I needed to know what the hell happens. But also, I just think these episodes are dramatically so powerful. They are absolutely unsparing in what they depict. Like, the moment where I wrote in my notes, oh my god, this is fucking wild, is when you start seeing the bombs go off from Garalia's missiles, and it's like, of course this would happen. Of course she would just start firing stuff off. But Tomino always follows these things to their logical extent. And the logical extent is not only that they are in the most densely populated area on planet Earth, which is Tokyo, Japan, downtown Tokyo. And she's firing off missiles, but also there's this lore detail that the atmosphere of Byston Well actually softens the explosions, so the bombs, like Shot Weapon has built what are more powerful bombs than you would expect on Earth, so what's going off is even worse than napalm, and then we get the number that she killed over 300,000 people, and it's just like, god damn, what am I watching? Truly like mind-boggling stuff here from Mr. Tomino.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And one thing I love about it is, that shift is so harsh and violent, where all of a sudden you're like presented this little like scene from a family drama, right? Where you're like, the camera cuts when Show gets into the Aura Road, and you're just there at his family home with his dad and just like, it's so Tomino, it's so evocative, this awful family, and why, and it just tells you so much about Show and why he is the way that he is. That his dad is there. He's got this like secretary woman named Yoko who he's obviously sleeping with. The mom comes home partway through, and she clearly knows that the guy is sleeping with this girl, and like this awful, like terrible dynamic. She is this like education critic or whatever. She's kind of, like beyond like this sort of quote unquote tiger mom sort of cliche, but this like woman who works in the world of education, but in like a kind of like hypothetical, like theoretical capacity, not as like a teacher. And they're just arguing and bickering at each other about their relationship with Show. Clearly, none of them really understand him at all, and like why he's run away from home and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, just like this massive explosion, fucking Show and the Dunbine crash through half the house. They freak out. Show comes out in his armor. And just that moment where he looks at him, it's like, my mom, my dad, like, I can't believe I'm at my home. And they're fucking screaming, treating him like he's some sort of alien monster. And then that whole arc is like this, like, they continue to struggle to believe that this guy is their son. And like can't accept him for the person he is. And there's just this great sort of like fundamental metaphor there of, it is this sort of, the fantasy elements make it extreme and kind of monstrous that he is not the person that they think he is, because he is this warrior, and he's wearing this armor, and he's dealing with all this crazy shit. But also just fundamentally, he's not the person that particularly the mom wants as a son, right? His mom feels not all that different from like Drake and Drake's wife Luza, and that it feels like she sees her son as an extension of her own kind of social reputation. And the dad's a little bit more understanding, but also clearly is not a great father. He's sleeping with the secretary at home, all this kind of shit.
He's not standing up to the mom enough. Like,
yeah,
he clearly he wasn't there for Show the way Show needed in this like toxic environment.
Yeah, and so it's this way in which his whole, that like the thing he is fighting against, the Drake Luft and all that stuff, is in many ways like this extension of this thing that he's been dealing with since he was a child, of these people who use others as kind of social currency. The form that takes in the like kind of relatively peaceful world of 1980s Japan is very different than in this kind of medieval brutal world in the midst of a war, but it's all fundamentally part of the same problem, just at kind of different phases in society. And that this sort of, corruption at the heart of society that also has infected Byston Well, that then comes bursting out. And it's just, that is such a dynamic, incredible story that is just one you just don't see coming at all. And it shows you all these layers to Show's character. This guy who's a loner, this guy who feels like he doesn't really fit in, whether he was in Byston Well or in his regular world, and one who has, understands the kind of pain that this stuff causes, and that drives him to be this kind of heroic figure that causes him to like kind of start to break out of this shell. And it's such a shocking turn, because all of the pieces of what the story is dealing with exist. It's paying off lots of little kind of bits that it's set along the way, but it's such a harsh shift. It's such a sudden shift that it feels like you are just kind of rewiring your brain to try to like put together what the show is doing, because it's so going off in a direction you would never have anticipated.
And it is like truly a narrative magic trick of up through episode 15, I would probably say Show Zama is not a particularly remarkable Tomino protagonist, like interesting in some places, but not like the driver of the series. And then on a fucking dime, when you get that context in episode 16, and then in the following episodes with, now he is in a scenario where he's the only person who can take action, truly, right? Him and Garalia, and he is responsible for all of this. He is put into a situation of true extremity. Like, the way everything we've seen through that character in those first 15 episodes coalesces and crystallizes into this very vivid character, I think, and someone you are fascinated by and want to follow more and find, like heroic and interesting in really fascinating ways, in part because of the choices he has to make here. Like, I think one of those moments where it's just, you're just tying so many strands of who this guy is together is in, I think it's episode 18, when he finally realizes how little he can do here, and the only way to save his parents is to, like, cut ties with them, when he just admits, he's like, yeah, I am an alien, and he makes up this story of, like, I'm from this other galaxy, we're here to blah, 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 I took the form of this young man because of blah, 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 and, don't treat my parents harshly. And it is the way he is just ready on a dime to throw that off. And it is both a selfless action because he puts a target on his back and saves his parents, but it is also a severing of ties. It is this realization of that there is nothing for me here. These people don't really care about me. It's effectively him going no contact with narcissistic parents, if you put it into, like, modern, psychology terms. But also in this kind of self-sacrificing way so that he can go, and he's also going to go get Gorali and try to save her and get back to Byston Well. And it's just the way he kicks into action there, and the way he comes into his own as a protagonist. It's actually pretty wild to me that Tomino didn't have this in the outline early on, because I'm wondering what in an alternate form would have been the thing that puts Show truly, like, snaps him into place as our protagonist. Because every character needs that. Amuro doesn't fully snap into place until Coming Home, if you want to use the Gundam example, right? And this is that moment for Show, and it is extra astonishing because of the crazy context it is in.
Well, yeah, and I think part of it for Tomino is that, like, one of the specific things he didn't like about what episode 1 ended up being was that Show was backgrounded more than he wanted, because Show is not thrown in the mix of the action. Instead, he's just there as a passive observer as things about the world are explained to him. He ends up starting off on the show more passive than I think Tomino wanted him to be. So I think it's like he saw that and he course corrected to say, like, we got to put this way earlier and really shock that out of the audience and really kind of make you reassess Show as a kind of main character. And I think that structure, even though it wasn't the original intention, ends up being probably better than it would have been otherwise, because I think it makes the story very unique and it gives it a very distinctive contour you're not really familiar with from other shows you've seen. And it is also just like because even within just like the sequence after you get into it, it's just full of like surprising kind of turns you don't expect. Like, I think the thing you expect is that, yes, he has this really struggled relationship with his parents. It is a thing that's defined him, but now he's trying to reconnect with them. And I think the normal thing to do is that reconnection is successful to some extent, that there's some kind of reconciliation that is reached between the child and the parents. And here it's just not. And it goes so far as, I think one of the most shocking moments is when the mom pulls a gun on Show, like screaming at him that like he is not her son. And it becomes clear to Show that the subtext of what she's saying is that she fully understands that Show is literally her son, but him being in this situation, being suspected of being an alien, being connected in any way to this mass death incident means that he puts her position in society in risk. And so she has to be this person she has been, she has to full bodily reject him, and she fucking pulls the trigger and shoots at him and barely misses. And that's the moment where Show realizes there can be no reconciliation. There is no world for me here. There's no family for me here, that he has to go back to Byston Well. And it's like such a brutal moment. And it's like that the mom pulling the trigger and actually firing that shot. It's like, it's such a despicable thing for her to do. But I think it reads very honest with the characters as Tomino has outlined them at that point. I think it really adds to Show's character that his parents are that awful and that home situation is that terrible and it's that fractured that he's kind of managed to build himself up as this like really heroic person to fight against these kinds of things and these kinds of people he grew up around.
and having made those decisions, coming back and being the hero Byston Well really needs, because he saunters back into Byston Well as an unimpeachable badass. I don't know if he thinks of himself that way, but we sure as shit do, given what he does at the end of episode 19. But yeah, and the one last thing to say here is that, like, obviously there's resonances in the stuff with the mom with Coming Home, the Gundam episode, but then also just how much these episodes on Earth are a rehearsal for the beginning of Zeta Gundam. And the way the first 5 episodes of Zeta Gundam, if you don't remember, are really structured around Camille's relationship with his mom and dad, who both ultimately die in that stretch of episode, and he's left an orphan. But it is kind of the disintegration of those relationships in addition to their death. And, like, it really defines Camille as a protagonist for us going forward. And it does, like, this is such a clear, like, dry run for a lot of those ideas that it's another just piece of the evolution from, like, Coming Home to beginning of Zeta Gundam.
Yeah, and it definitely feels something of, like, Tomino looking at the world. And at this point, he is a father, right? A father of 2 daughters. This is something we didn't talk about with Zabungle, is how much is him being a father of, I think at this point, his daughters would be, like, almost teenagers, if not full teenagers. And how much is the kind of, for Murasame, Elchi Cargo, Katejina-san, the, like, woman who, like, you love that turns against you, is that, like, a raising teenage daughters who are rebelling against you? How much of, like, is that, who knows? I don't want to read too deeply into that stuff. But, he as a person in the world, his relationship with the world is changing in his capacity as a parent. And it feels like there's definitely this distinctive theme in a lot of his 80s work of these parents that, in this kind of, this era of abundance, post-war, coming into the bubble economy, who prize this kind of, like, social status, wealth, these other things well above being parents, and this kind of, like, the latchkey kid stuff of that, like they're never really home, the kid has to raise themselves. Like, a lot of the Ultraman shows from, like, the mid to late 70s have a lot of stories that are around this theme as well. Godzilla's Revenge, that Godzilla movie we've covered before, that's the story of that. It feels like Tomino kind of looking at that and creating stories around this idea of the ways in which parenting has changed at this period in Japanese society and culture. And yes, like, it very much shows parents feel like a rehearsal for where Camille's parents will go, to the extent that Chiyo Zama, the show's mom, is voiced by Takashima Gada, who also voices Camille's mom in Zeta Gundam. So he goes so far as to recast the same actress for the mom role. One small note, the father, Shinkazama, is voiced by Hashi Takuya. A lot of great actor, been in a lot of great roles, such as Kakuzu and Naruto, but he is also Brian the computer from episode 1 of Dirty Pair, which I always just find funny, because the computer that clearly was supposed to be named Brain, but instead was named Brian. So we have some good actors playing these characters here. But it is just, like, a very evocative, I think, resonant type of characterization that is certainly, when you're looking at the historical context, is very of the moment of things that Japanese society was very concerned about.
Yeah, and again, just to, like, back up on the kind of personal aspects and the family stuff, you're not speculating fully in knowing that Tomino brings that into his work. Like, just from what we know later on, that, like, how much dance becomes a part of his stuff in the 2000s is because his daughter became a, like, well-respected dance choreographer, and he was fascinated with this. So, like, those things are, to what extent, obviously we can only speculate on, but I think it's not wrong to, like, think about that here. Absolutely. And that's a very trenchant analysis. Yeah.
And obviously, like, as with anybody, you're being a parent and stuff like that, and your relationships in the world are going to affect your art. I just don't want to take the, like, he was raising teenage daughters, and that's why he has all these stories about girls that rebel. It's like, that might be part of it, but I don't want to just, like, boil down his work to that. But, I wouldn't be surprised if certainly that is, like, a thing that he's, like, would have been dealing with and thinking about his relationship with women, being a father, and struggling with that dynamic. I'm certain is a part of it, but people always take those kinds of criticisms or, like, analyses too far as some sort of, like, this explains the secret of the ending of Zeta Gundam explained. Tomino was a dad.
Right. I think another way to say it is that he is someone who, because he has a wife and 2 daughters, so he's the guy in the house, and he's someone fascinated in his work with women, right, in all sorts of ways, but in this, like, deep, like, psychological need to understand way, and that's another way I think that comes out. Anyway, but yeah, this last stretch of episodes here, just absolutely masterful. I am in awe of like the turn this show makes here, and I stopped myself from watching further just to preserve the purity of the podcast experience. But I am very excited to finish recording and go watch more because, again, you get to the end of episode 19 just on such a cloud nine and so ready to see what happens next, because the show who re-enters Byston Well is a very, not a different person, but he's a very evolved person. And he is someone who, I think those characters, you also see this with like Marvel and Keen and the ones who are left, how much they need. Like when he's gone, they realize how key he was to that operation, and he's even more ready to do stuff now. So, fuck yeah, I want more right away.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I've watched a little bit beyond episode 19 because I was trying to figure out what would be the good stopping point, and I really liked the episodes that immediately follow this. And I'm very excited to see the second half of the show because, again, all the stuff I know about Aura Battler Dunbine almost entirely is from stuff that I know is in the last like 12 to 15 episodes. Is mostly what Super Robot Wars historically is pulled from, because it's true of Y and Alpha. Alpha being the one from 2000. And so there's a lot of things that are very interested. I know that there are certain elements of the second half of the show that are a little bit sort of controversial is not the right word, divisive amongst the fan base. That there are people who really like the second half, there are people who don't like the or in less second half, like the last like core or so of episodes. So I'm very interested to actually see all that in context. But yes, the Aura Battler Dunbine, like this show has been so much fun. It is just so my shit. You know, like all this like crazy fantasy stuff, but it's so Victorian inflected. But also it's fucking crazy Tomino mecha shit. And there's a whole speech I wrote on Celtic mythology that we're just going to save for that episode because we're already 3 hours in here. But I've got lots of thoughts on like the setting of Byston Well, what it means, where it kind of comes from, because it's just like so much crazy shit here.
Well, and in the same way we saved the discussion of the E-Day thematically for our second E-Day on episode, I think it probably is fitting to save the Byston Well thematic discussion for next time, because that's its own can of worms. And I love Byston Well. It is already one of my favorite fantasy settings, more for just the way it is framed and atmospherically feels than anything. And I think that goes to the Celtic stuff we'll talk about next time. But yeah, I want to learn about the place where our souls all came from, Sean.
Yes, absolutely. So next time we will be covering the rest of Aura Battler Dunbine, just as like a little thing for people, just because, you know, you people might be looking stuff up. There is a compilation movie series that was made, or like OVAs really, in 1988, and there is a like pseudo sequel OVA called New Story of Aura Battler Dunbine. Neither of those were really made with Tomino's involvement all that much, and so we're not going to cover those. But if people want to, that stuff is out there. I think the compilation movies are a little hard to find in English, but New Story of Aura Battler Dunbine, if you want to see that stuff, you can, but not Tomino, so it's not going to be in our Tomino-thon. What we will cover is the rest of Aura Battler Dunbine, episodes 20 to 49. See what happens with this crazy story and what happens in Byston Well.
信じほど美しい時代ない